As Good as a Lord. Written by P.O. Dixon. Narrated by Andy Robert. Chapter 1. Secrets. Fitzwilliam Darcy rubbed both hands over his face. Will I learn to love again? Is there another woman for me? One who is better suited than Miss Elizabeth Bennet is? Can I open my heart to her? And if not my entire heart, then enough to marry her and carry her off to Pemberley to share with me the rest of my days? A proud man, accustomed to having his way, Darcy sat opposite his cousin, Colonel Richard Fitzwilliam, as the stately carriage pulled away from the changing station in Bromley. After putting off his plans to return to London several times, the events of the prior day had rendered further delay pointless. How could I have been so mistaken about her feelings for me? I went to her and offered my hand in marriage with every expectation of a favourable reply, only to have my offer spurned with undue malice and unmitigated contempt. Learning the heart of her animosity towards him was rooted in falsehoods levelled against him by the likes of George Wickham, a childhood friend whom he now abhorred, and knowing that she held that scoundrel in such high esteem, was cause for him to realise he never really knew her at all. He brushed a hand across his face once again, wishing to rid himself of the unpleasant memory. He likened his fate to having dodged a bullet, but that did not make it any less painful. The truth was, despite his objectionable, ill-worded, and poorly conceived proposal, he cared deeply for Elizabeth. He wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. The Colonel, who had been observing his cousin in silent wonderment, said, "Come on now, old fellow. Surely you're not lamenting the unpleasant scene with our aunt this morning. Soon enough she will accustom herself to the truth, and learn to accept it." I should have told Lady Catherine years ago that I had no intention of honouring her favourite wish that Anne and I would marry. Not that she would have listened. His aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, had an uncanny knack for hearing only that which conformed to her own view of things. However, Darcy continued, if I'm to be honest, I would have to say that my present attitude has nothing at all to do with our aunt's wounded expectations. The Colonel sat up straight, his interest piqued. Pray, would it have anything to do with the lovely Miss Elizabeth Bennet? His cousin knew him very well. They were, after all, the closest of friends. However, Darcy had gone out of his way not to give a hint of his preference for Miss Elizabeth to anyone. Not until he had entirely made up his mind to offer his hand to her. Apparently I hid my feelings a little too well as far as Miss Elizabeth is concerned, and not well enough so far as my cousin is. Perhaps Richard knows nothing, and is merely baiting me as he is wont to do. Miss Elizabeth Bennet? Darcy said, his eyes questioning. Why would you suggest my mood has anything to do with her? Don't think I did not notice your hasty departure from Rosings last night when you realised she would not be joining our party. I could only assume you went to see her. The Colonel arched his brow. Or am I mistaken? I would rather not say where I went or what I did last evening. Ha! As that is not a denial of my assertion, I shall then assume I'm correct in thinking you went to see the lady. What you do or do not think is none of my concern, just as where I went and what I did is none of yours. You're rather testy, cousin. Well, you shall keep your secrets. Thank you for respecting my privacy. You will not mind if I ask of your plans when we arrive in town, I pray? It is the height of the season, after all, and with that comes a fresh wave of young debutantes in want of husbands. Are you prepared for the onslaught? Or do you mean to eschew those gaieties at which you might find yourself on display? On the contrary, I intend to throw myself into the London scene upon my return, to smile at every simpering debutante and dance with them to their heart's content. Surely one of the young women will attract my fancy now that I'm resolved to fill the empty space in my life that can only be occupied by a wife. A feeling of resignation mixed with regret washed over him. I begin to consider that the greatest part of me will always love Elizabeth. However, she does not love me, and thus I must start anew. It is time I choose a wife." Thus resolved, Darcy closed his eyes as if wishing to block out the world, but his innermost concerns would not be repressed. "I may not love her at first. I dare say it'll be impossible, as my heart belongs to another. However, if I choose prudently, as I indeed intend to, then surely love will follow." Some weeks later, Hertfordshire. Each night that passed found Elizabeth more restless than the one before. Troubling thoughts of what had unfolded in Kent haunted her days and invaded her dreams at night. Making matters worse, she and her dearest sister Jane had been reunited for weeks. Still, she had not breathed a word to her about what actually happened in Kent. Would Jane even believe her? Elizabeth could hardly believe it herself. "Mr. Darcy offered his hand in marriage to me." Besides the obvious reason of no one believing her, Elizabeth had kept her silence on the matter for other, more compelling reasons as well. For one, her mother, Mrs. Frances Bennet, would be livid if she were to learn that Elizabeth, the second eldest of 5 daughters whose marital prospects were wanting, had spurned yet another marriage proposal. Mrs. Bennet's ensuing vexation would throw the entire household into utter turmoil for weeks, if not months. Mrs. Bennet's scathing protests when Elizabeth rejected her cousin, Mr. William Collins, last autumn would be nothing compared to how she would bear the news that her daughter had refused the hand of a gentleman with £10,000 a year. Elizabeth's second reason really had to do with protecting her sister Jane from being hurt. If she were to tell Jane that one of the principal reasons she refused Mr. Darcy's hand was because of the part he had played in separating her from Mr. Bingley, it would only give rise to hurt feelings, the likes of which Jane had spent the past weeks endeavouring to overcome. She would never forget how heartbroken Jane was when Charles Bingley left Netherfield, her neighbouring estate. Jane had gone to London shortly after that with the hope of seeing the young man, but his sisters and Mr. Darcy himself had thwarted her efforts. "I have no wish to deny that I did everything in my power to separate my friend from your sister, or that I rejoice in my success." Such was Mr. Darcy's adamant avowal when Elizabeth confronted him with the truth she had gleaned from an earlier conversation with Colonel Fitzwilliam, Mr. Darcy's cousin. The Colonel's account alone had been enough to bolster Elizabeth's dislike of the proud Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Nothing he had said since arriving at the parsonage that fateful evening served to sway her in that regard. His confession of admiring her most ardently gave her pause, yet his admission of liking her against his will put an end to that. "Towards him I've been kinder than towards myself." Those 9 words might undoubtedly have cemented her heart against him, were it not for the letter he'd handed her that next day. Despite the impropriety in such a gesture, he had sought to address the 2 harshest accusations she had levelled against him in refusing his hand. The weightier of her accusations against him regarded his supposed misdeeds towards a Lieutenant George Wickham, and the other appertained to his part in separating her sister Jane and his friend Charles Bingley. By the former he painted a more telling portrait of the man whom she had once believed to be everything that was good. In truth, Wickham was everything but good. He had persuaded her, and anyone else who would listen, that he was a victim of Mr. Darcy's cold, cruel nature, when it was Wickham himself who was no more than a lying, mean-hearted opportunist, and one who blamed others for his misfortunes. By the other, Mr. Darcy had persuaded her that his intentions had been pure. He had acted in service to a friend, whom he had no wish to witness surrender himself to a disadvantageous alliance. He said he had seen no evidence that Jane's heart had been touched by his friend. How could Elizabeth fault him in that? Jane rarely shows her true feelings to anyone. Anyone who does not indeed know her as I do must certainly share a similar opinion to Mr. Darcy's. Elizabeth was nearly 21, and Jane older than that. Then there were the 3 younger sisters, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. 5 daughters who were not 8 years apart. 5 daughters who were all out. Things could not go on that way, especially not for the 2 eldest, living a carefree existence in their father's home. The estate was entailed to the male line of the family. A distant cousin, Mr. Collins, whose hand Elizabeth had spurned last autumn, stood to inherit everything. He might very well turn all of them out as soon as Mr. Bennet passed, and then where would they be? Elizabeth was a sensible woman. She knew she must marry. It would be reckless of her to assume otherwise. Having rejected 2 gentlemen's proposals in less than 6 months, she might well be obliged to accept the next offer of marriage. Is a 3rd proposal even a possibility? How likely am I to meet another gentleman whose acquaintance I have not made, and whose presence I can tolerate? Another part of her whispered, how likely is this supposed gentleman to be comparable to Mr. Darcy? This notion that she was somehow second-guessing her actions in Kent did not sit well with Elizabeth. She bolted up in bed, pounded her pillow once or twice, and then settled back down. Lizzie, her sister Jane said, I rather supposed you were asleep. No, I'm not. Pray, you do not mind me saying so, but I can't help noticing that you've been particularly distracted since your return from Kent. It's nothing to concern yourself with, I assure you, dearest Jane. Pray, go back to sleep. Unwilling to be dissuaded as easily as that, Jane sat up in defiance. Not until you tell me what is the matter. What is it that has you so distracted of late? Pray, you're not still fretting over Papa's decision to allow Lydia to go to Brighton with the Forsters? I'm just as concerned as you are that Lydia's wild spirits might be hard to contain, but we must trust the Colonel will not allow her to meet with any harm. It's not so much I do not trust the Colonel, but more his officers. The Colonel has more important things to attend than a girl who is not yet 16. You and I both know how overjoyed Lydia was in describing to us how Mr. Wickham was safe from Mr. King upon our return from town. You're worried about what Mr. Darcy said about the gentleman's character, are you not? With good reason, Elizabeth said with energy. She recalled her not having told Jane the entire story about Wickham's past, but she had told her enough for Jane to question why Mr. Darcy would have told her anything. Why would someone of Mr. Darcy's temperament divulge such intimate details of his personal life to someone so wholly unconnected with him? Jane had asked. Is there something more that you're not telling me about your time in Kent? While Elizabeth always supposed that her sister Jane rarely shared her true feelings with anyone, in truth, Elizabeth was hiding her feelings. Already she was gradually questioning herself, re-examining her sentiments, and showing some regret over having rejected Mr. Darcy's proposal. She supposed it was possible to confide in Jane some portion of what had happened, and why she had acted as she did without mentioning others. There was the matter of the gentleman's ill treatment of Lieutenant George Wickham, which, despite Elizabeth knowing better now, at the time had been a strong inducement in her staunch refusal of Mr. Darcy's hand. Elizabeth sat up in bed. Jane, you will not believe what happened to me while I was in Kent. Does this have anything to do with Mr. Darcy? Puzzled, Elizabeth asked, Why would you think that? From my knowing he was there also. It is no secret that the two of you do not always get along, despite his having confided in you regarding Mr. Wickham's true character. Oh, dearest Jane, that is precisely the reason I find all this so troubling. What happened? Did the two of you get into some sort of altercation? In a manner of speaking, that is exactly what occurred. That is to say, immediately after he offered me his hand in marriage. Jane gasped. Are you secretly engaged? I most certainly am not. Elizabeth stiffened. She thought she heard a thump from the other side of the door. Did you hear that? Jane could not say that she did. Elizabeth shrugged. I suppose it's merely my imagination. Who would be afoot at this hour? Why did you not tell me any of this before? You cannot know how much I wanted to tell you, but I did not want to put you in the uncomfortable position of keeping secrets from Mamma. Oh, Jane, you and I know only too well how impossible my life would be were our mother to learn that I spurned such an advantageous alliance. The moon was high in the midnight sky, and the lady of the house was quite restless. This must certainly account for Mrs. Bennet's being out of bed at that hour when the house was otherwise still. That and a healthy dose of fate, for what she heard while passing by the slightly ajar door of her eldest daughter's room might very well be the means of changing the rest of her life. Why, she was certain it would. She only needed to devise the means of using this newly discovered information to her best advantage. The first half hour after her startling discovery she spent pacing the floor. "What a sly creature Lizzie is," she cried to herself, for she was the only one in the room. "Everyone in Meryton is aware that Mr. Darcy was in Kent at Easter. Sir William saw to that bit of information. He and his daughter Maria, Lucas. Lizzie said nothing of his being there. Of course, no one expected her to. Everyone knows how much she has always hated the man. Nevertheless, is that any excuse to refuse such a man as Mr. Darcy? Oh, what on earth was she thinking?" Mrs. Bennet drifted to the window and stared out into the darkness. Fretting while watching the moon slip behind the cloud, she said, "Obstinate, headstrong girl. She has been the means of frustrating my hopes not once, but twice. Who does she think she is, always rejecting proposals of marriage from decent, respectable men?" The aggrieved matriarch was half tempted to march into her husband's room, awaken him from his sleep, and consult him on the matter. Instead, she made it to the door before the memory of what had happened last autumn halted her footsteps. Alas, recollections of the nasty business with Mr. Collins flooded her mind. "I will not marry the odious man. You cannot force me to either." Mrs. Bennet winced. It was months ago, and yet her daughter's defiance distressed her still, and gave her cause to wonder what she had done to deserve such a disloyal child. She had thought that surely her husband would be an ally in forcing Elizabeth to be reasonable, even though he always considered their second-born his favourite. His flippant reply had been the means of placating the latter and wounding the former. "An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do." Mrs. Bennet, who had persuaded herself that her husband regarded the affair as she wished, was excessively disappointed. Her own husband had been a party to ruining her fondest wish that the next mistress of Longbourn would be one of her daughters, owing to that ridiculous entail on the estate to the male line. "I shall have no hope at all in getting Mr. Bennet to force Lizzie to marry where she will not, this time either. Such a marriage would be the means of saving us all," she silently lamented. "Why, even I would not have been so foolish as to refuse such a man as Mr. Darcy, even if he is haughty and above his company. The man has £10,000 a year. How rich and how great she might have been! What pin money, what jewels, what carriages she might have had! If only I'd had the slightest hint of Mr. Darcy's regard for Lizzie, I might have better spent my time encouraging a match in that quarter. Instead, I wasted my time on his inconstant friend Mr. Bingley and my Jane. Mr. Bingley is nothing to Mr. Darcy, nothing at all. Lizzie might have had a house in town. Everything that is charming. 10,000 a year, and very likely more. 'Tis as good as a lord." A fierce motherly impulse infused Mrs. Bennet's resolve. "I cannot stand idly by and allow such an opportunity as this to escape. Mr. Darcy proposed to my Lizzie once. Surely he can be worked on, and thereby persuaded to do so again. I shall take matters into my own hands and see that he does." Chapter 2. Holds a Candle. Unable to dwell wholeheartedly on the more pleasant aspects of her long-awaited northern tour, Elizabeth's busy mind, whenever not fretting over her younger sister Lydia's being far away in Brighton, in proximity to Mr. Wickham, was otherwise engaged in thoughts of her last talk with her father. "I begin to think it is more than Lydia's going to Brighton that is the cause of your mother's malaise. Need I remind you that she has suffered the loss of not one but 2 potential sons-in-law? There is no telling how long the impact will last," he had opined. "You know very well that it is her business in life to see her daughters settled. You can have no doubt what that did to her. Not that I blame you, my child, for I could not have endured losing you to the likes of Mr. Collins, nor to any other man of our acquaintance. I cannot imagine any man who deserves you. Elizabeth recalled thinking to herself, actually 3 potential sons-in-law, but no one must learn of the third, especially her mother. She drew her eyes from the window long enough to study the carriage's other occupants. Sitting directly across from her was Mr. Edward Gardner, her mother's brother. Sitting next to him was her aunt, Mrs. Madeline Gardner. The former, a sensible, gentlemanlike man, was waging a battle against the son's seductive slumber, and failing miserably. The latter, an educated, stylish woman of impeccable taste, was reading a fashion magazine. Glancing to her left, her father's words intruded once more. "Pray, Lizzie, what is the matter? You do not seem excited about the upcoming trip to the north. I hope it has nothing to do with the fact that your mother will be joining you. You and I both know how distracted she has been of late, acting in a manner that my eyes have not beheld in more than 20 years. Elizabeth did not like the idea of her mother travelling with them at all, but to give voice to such an objection would surely have painted her as selfish, thinking only of herself and suffering a callous disregard for the feelings of others. These were the very complaints she had levelled against Mr. Darcy. If she could take but one comfort from the scheme, it was that her mother had no knowledge of what happened with Mr. Darcy in Kent, that Elizabeth had rejected his proposal of marriage. She placed her hand on her mother's, and gave it a gentle squeeze, as she recalled her father's words that this time away in the north was exactly what her mother needed. Elizabeth was indeed worried about her mother. Even now she keeps herself to herself, with little talk of grievances and vexations, not even the more pleasing topics she is always wont to discuss when she and Aunt Gardner are together, talk of the latest London fashions and the like. Drawing her eyes back to the window, she released a barely perceptible sigh. What on earth is Mamma about? Mrs. Bennet sat quietly observing the passing landscapes, but her mind was all aflutter. For the 1000th time, she silently congratulated herself. She was in possession of the most fantastic news that anyone could possibly imagine, and she had managed to hold her tongue. It was a wonder she had not bitten it off in light of the firm grip she had held on it. What an extraordinary actress she had been in convincing everyone of her general malaise, while keeping to herself what she knew. No one would be more surprised than the lady herself would. Aside from getting her 5 daughters married off to respectable men, gossiping with her friends and neighbours was what she lived for. She smiled and sighed knowingly. My second eldest daughter is not the only Bennet capable of keeping a secret. The thought did occur to her more than a time or two that persuading her brother Gardner and his wife to allow her to join them on their long-awaited trip to the north was the easy part. The bulk of her scheme relied purely upon circumstances. How was she to be sure that they would go to Pemberley? Were she successful in prevailing upon them to apply for a tour of the renowned Derbyshire estate, what was the likelihood that Mr. Darcy would be there? Mrs. Bennet knew enough about the great men of Mr. Darcy's ilk to know they were rarely at home. I shall not worry about all that just now. One step at a time is all I can manage. It will be enough that Lizzie gets a chance to see all that she has thumbed her nose at, and then she will be sorry for what she has done. Foolish, headstrong girl that she is, no doubt she will be lamenting her decision the moment she first lays eyes on the place. It will be more important than ever that I keep my part in the scheme to myself. She must think her falling for the gentleman is her own doing. Short of that, some sort of compromise of Lizzie would be needed. Heaven forbid it comes to that. But I must at least allow for the possibility, for why would a gentleman of Mr. Darcy's consequence offer his hand to the same woman more than once? Such musings led to equally confounding conjectures. Mrs. Bennet could not fathom the reason Mr. Darcy had offered his hand to her second eldest in the first place, when her eldest daughter was the beauty in the family. My Lizzie can boast of her reputation as being the brightest jewel in the country. Theretofore, Mrs. Bennet had given no credence to such a claim. There is no accounting for another person's taste, she supposed. With that, she went about her quiet plotting. Darcy and Charles Bingley sat across from each other at a dimly lit table in a corner of White's, the former favourite haunt of late. "About your invitation to my family and me to visit Pemberley this summer," Bingley began, "I'm afraid that we will be unable to accept. I hope I do not need to tell you how disappointed we all are, especially my sister Caroline, but I'm afraid that family matters in Scarborough will command the greater share of our attention." The thought of not having to endure Bingley's younger sister did not meet with Darcy's displeasure in the least bit, but he would indeed miss his friend, especially this summer, he silently pondered. Having thrown himself into the London season, as he had vowed to do in an effort to forget his disastrous proposal to Miss Elizabeth Bennet, and the mockery she had made of his feelings by her bitter rejections, Darcy's life had become heavily entangled with the lives of a Lord Harold Davenport, the Earl of Stafford, and his wife, Lady Charlotte, and their 2 daughters. The older of the 2 by nearly 2 years was Lady Althea. The younger was Lady Bethany. Where Lady Althea was elegant and sensible, Lady Bethany was charming and high-spirited. If the speculation among their circle was true, his lordship's palatial estate in Staffordshire was in dire need of a healthy infusion of cash, in order that his family might continue to live the lifestyle worthy of his noble status. There was little wonder his invitation to Darcy to spend time at his estate had conveniently changed into an invitation for the Davenports to visit Pemberley during the best part of summer instead. Darcy said, "I'm sorry to hear you say that, my friend, but I suppose it is just as well, for it seems that I am to entertain Lord Davenport and his family for the summer. If his lordship had his way, an alliance between our 2 families might well ensue." "Lord Davenport, you say? Unless I am mistaken, he has 2 unmarried daughters." "Which of the 2 does the Earl have in mind as the next mistress of Pemberley?" "I would say the gentleman does not much care." "And what say you?" The lovely Davenport daughters were but 2 of the many young women Darcy had flattered with attention over the past several weeks, all in vain. He could not help comparing every one of them with Elizabeth, and finding them wanting. He shrugged. "I'm afraid I'm of the same mind." "Surely that will change over the course of the summer?" Leaning back in his chair and crossing one leg over the other, Darcy replied, "No doubt that is the Earl's plan." Bingley said, "It is fortunate, I suppose, that things have worked out as they have, thereby preventing our coming to Pemberley. The last thing you need is 3 women vying for your affections." Bingley was referring to his sister Caroline's tendency to use every possible inducement to attract Darcy's notice. "Indeed, 3 women, and neither of them holds a candle to the one who holds my heart," Darcy said in a low voice. Bingley inquired, "What was that you said, old fellow?" Darcy held up his hand. "Oh, it is inconsequential." Taking a sip of his drink, he silently admonished himself, "I must learn to stop thinking this way." To his dismay, he saw his young friend smirking. "May I ask what you find so amusing?" "Well, Darcy, I know how much you abhor being the recipient of but one young woman's endeavours to win your favour. However shall you manage 2? Chapter 3. Mistress of all this. Learning that her mother's favourite wish for their northern tour was to see Pemberley puzzled Elizabeth exceedingly, for she knew how much her mother despised Mr. Darcy. It all had to do with his slight of Elizabeth when they first made the gentleman's acquaintance at the Meryton Assembly just under a year ago. "She's tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. I'm in no humour at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men." Not that Mrs. Bennet had heard him speak the poisonous words, but Elizabeth had, and she had made sure others knew what the gentleman had said. "I suppose in part I have myself to thank for her low opinion of Mr. Darcy," she considered, especially as she recalled her mother's open disparagement of the gentleman in his presence. In vain did Elizabeth endeavour to check the rapidity of her mother's words, or persuade her to describe her felicity over what she supposed would be a most advantageous alliance between her eldest daughter Jane and Mr. Darcy's friend Mr. Bingley, in a less audible whisper that night at supper during the Netherfield ball. To her inexpressible vexation, she could perceive that Mr. Darcy, who sat opposite them, overheard the chief of it. "Do not be nonsensical, child," Mrs. Bennet scolded. "Pray, what is Mr. Darcy to me that I should be afraid of him? I am sure we owe him no such particular civility as to be obliged to say nothing he may not like to hear." "For heaven's sake, speak lower," Elizabeth beseeched. "What advantage can it be for you to offend Mr. Darcy? You'll never recommend yourself to his friend by so doing." Little good it did. Nothing that she could say had any influence. Her mother continued talking of her views in the same intelligible tone. Elizabeth had blushed, and blushed again with shame and vexation. She could not help frequently glancing at Mr. Darcy, and every glance further convinced her of what she dreaded. For though he was not always looking at her mother, Elizabeth was convinced that her mamma invariably fixed his attention. She recalled seeing the expression on his face as it changed gradually from indignant contempt to composed and steady gravity. Elizabeth shuddered at this remembrance. "And this is the man whose home my mother is longing to see?" Her aunt's desire to see Pemberley, however, was not so easily ignored, and therefore caused Elizabeth a fair amount of distress. Elizabeth felt that she of all people had no business at Mr. Darcy's home after having rejected his hand so coldly. The journey thus far had afforded her the opportunity to see many remarkable places: Oxford, Blenheim, Warwick, and Birmingham, to name a few. This, Elizabeth believed, provided her some excuse. When she was alone with her aunt, Elizabeth said, "I must own that I'm rather tired of seeing great houses after going over so many. To own the truth, I have no pleasure in fine carpets or satin curtains. If it were merely a fine, richly furnished house," Mrs. Gardiner scolded, "I should not care about it myself. However, the grounds at Pemberley are delightful. They are some of the finest woods in the country." Only the reassurance from one of the chambermaids at the inn in Lambton that Mr. Darcy had not returned to Derbyshire for the summer was enough to assuage Elizabeth's inner turmoil over visiting Pemberley. Indeed, such assurances awakened a desire in her that she had been secretly harbouring that she would one day see Pemberley for herself. What a shame it would be to be so near the place that might have been her own home had the hands of fate allowed it. A troubling thought intruded upon her. What if the young woman was mistaken? What if Mr. Darcy is indeed at Pemberley? Moreover, what if we should meet? Then what shall I do? Elizabeth's fears were quickly put to rest when she learned from the housekeeper, a Mrs. Reynolds, that Pemberley's master was away, and was not expected to return for a couple of days. A respectable-looking elderly woman, the housekeeper was less fine and more civil than Elizabeth had expected to find her. This was an added balm to Elizabeth's worried sensibilities. It was a greater comfort to her that her mother was too much in awe of the place to make a vulgar spectacle of herself, as Elizabeth had feared she might. At length, Elizabeth went to a window to enjoy its prospect. What a beautiful sight it was to behold! Every disposition of the ground was good, and she looked on the whole scene with utter delight. Mrs. Bennet eased beside her and gave Elizabeth a little nudge. Winking, she whispered, "Just imagine, my dearest Lizzie, to be mistress of all this must truly be something." "This is not the first time Mamma has suggested such a thing," Elizabeth considered. When she could, she told her as much. "Is there more to your wanting to come on this trip than any of us know?" "Why, I do declare, Lizzie, I do not know what you're talking about." She crossed one arm over the other. "Mamma?" "For heaven's sake, child, what are you accusing me of? Or perhaps the better question is if there is something about your being here in Mr. Darcy's home that I ought to know." Thus a standoff ensued, neither of the two wishing to divulge her secret. Elizabeth welcomed the chance to escape the others, to indulge herself with nonsensical musings of what it would have been like had she accepted Mr. Darcy's proposal, in spite of her determined objections. Her rebuke lingered in her mind. From the very beginning, from the first moment, I may almost say, of my acquaintance with you, your manners, impressing me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others, were such as to form the groundwork of disapprobation on which succeeding events have built so immovable a dislike. And I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry. Merely recalling her words was a cause of pain. Not one to dwell ever long on such memories, she pushed the thoughts from her head. She strolled along the lanes in perfect harmony with nature, and found something to admire everywhere she looked. All of Miss Caroline Bingley's praises had been insufficient in aptly describing Pemberley's essence. Though Elizabeth did not truly belong there, she could not rid herself of the feeling that Pemberley was exactly where she was meant to be. Not paying attention to where she was going, Elizabeth rounded a corner and found herself face to face with Mr. Darcy. How embarrassing this was for her. Even worse, he was not alone. Her first inclination was to turn and run. An awkward silence ensued, neither of them knowing what to say. "I knew I should never have come," she thought. Darcy turned to his walking companion. "Will you pardon me, Mr. Jones?" The other man nodded his consent, turned and walked away, leaving Darcy and Elizabeth alone. "Miss Elizabeth," he said, bowing as if remembering himself. Elizabeth curtsied. "Mr. Darcy," she said, her voice tentative. "I must say that this is indeed a surprise, seeing you again here, at Pemberley." "I'm sorry, sir. You see, well, I thought you were away, else I should never have come." By his expression, she realized her words had wounded him. She reached out her hand. "What I meant to say is that I had no wish to intrude, that surely you must find my being here impertinent, given all that has unfolded between us, and for that I'm sorry." He swallowed hard. "Which is it, Miss Elizabeth? Are you sorry you're here, or are you sorry about how things unfolded between us?" Elizabeth bit her lower lip in search of the right words to say. Before she could fashion a response, he said, "For if it is the former, I'm obliged to say that you need not suffer any regret for being here, for your presence meets with no objection on my part. I'm happy to see you. If it is the latter, then you must allow me to say I'm equally sorry for the way things unfolded between us. However, that is all in the past. I would like to think any ill feelings that might have resulted from that evening at the parsonage were eliminated by the letter that I handed you the next day. You did read it, did you not?" Elizabeth had not only read his letter, but she had also practically memorized it, especially the poignant opening. "Be not alarmed, madam, on receiving this letter, by the apprehension of its containing any repetition of those sentiments or renewal of those offers which were last night so disgusting to you. I write without any intention of paining you, or humbling myself, by dwelling on wishes which, for the happiness of both, cannot be too soon forgotten, and the effort that the formation and the perusal of this letter must occasion should have been spared had not my character required it to be written and read. You must therefore pardon the freedom with which I demand your attention. Your feelings, I know, will bestow it unwillingly, but I demand it of your justice." She said, "I did indeed, sir. Thank you for explaining things to me as you did. Now that I'm aware of the truth, I feel I did you a terrible injustice in taking Mr. Wickham's side and advocating so passionately on his behalf. It is enough for me to know that you believe me, and that you are safe from him." Elizabeth smiled. Darcy smiled too. "That being said, perhaps you will allow me to begin anew. I wish to start by welcoming you to Pemberley." "Thank you, sir. I'm visiting Derbyshire with my aunt and uncle and my mamma." "I trust the four of you are enjoying a pleasant trip?" "Indeed, it has been a pleasant trip, completely without incident." Where are you staying?
We are staying at the inn in Lambton, and I'm afraid I must be getting back to my party, else they shall wonder what has become of me.
May I accompany you?
Oh, that is not necessary. The last I saw them, they were walking in the direction of the lake. I shall have no trouble finding them on my own, I'm sure.
I insist. Chapter 4. An elaborate scheme. Darcy and Elizabeth had been walking along in companionable silence for nearly a quarter of an hour. So many times they had walked along in a similar fashion while in Kent. Those days, when he did talk, he would speak of things that only made sense to her now. The memories of those fateful days were still fresh in her mind. He never said a great deal, nor did she give herself the trouble of talking or of listening much. But it struck her in the course of their third encounter that he was asking some odd, unconnected questions about her pleasure in being at Hunsford, her love of solitary walks, and her opinion of Mr. and Mrs. Collins's happiness, and that, in speaking of Rosings and her not perfectly understanding the house, he seemed to expect that whenever she came into Kent again, she would be staying there too. It was now painfully clear that he meant the next time she visited Kent, it would be as his wife.
How was I to know he was courting me?
Elizabeth asked herself. It was absolutely necessary to have some conversation, else she would vex herself exceedingly over the events of their past, best not to dwell on at that particular time. Elizabeth cleared her throat.
How does Miss Darcy get along, sir?
My sister Georgiana is presently in Matlock with my aunt and uncle. She is expected here the day after tomorrow.
I am sorry to have missed her, for I should have liked to meet her very much, said Elizabeth.
Have you any idea how long your travels will keep you in these parts? Perhaps I might write and send for her. She will have been sorry to have missed you as well. By now they had entered a beautiful walk by the side of the water.
I'm afraid that will not be necessary, for my uncle has received word that he is needed back in London much sooner than he had planned. We must take our leave of Lambton tomorrow, if we are to keep with an already abbreviated schedule.
So soon? He said, his voice filled with a hint of disappointment. A great splashing sound drew their attention, and they looked around to see what it was. Panicky screams and the spectacle of Mrs. Bennet flapping her arms all about gave them their answer. In a second she went under. She resurfaced, struggled, went under again. Horror washed over Elizabeth.
My mother cannot swim!
Throwing off his jacket, Darcy raced to the water's edge and dived into the lake to save her. Elizabeth passed the chief part of the night in her mother's room, and in the morning suffered the great displeasure of seeing her health had deteriorated. Indeed, Mrs. Bennet suffered a sore throat, headache and chills, and she complained that this was no trifling cold, and that she might very well die unless she could help it. What was more, the attending physician agreed with Mrs. Bennet's dire self-prognosis. Imminent departure was out of the question for a woman of Mrs. Bennet's constitution. Bed rest was the best prescription, until all signs of danger passed. He told Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner as much when they arrived at Pemberley, with the intention of claiming Mrs. Bennet and Elizabeth for the return trip to Hertfordshire. "Are you quite sure this is the only remedy, sir?" asked Mr. Gardiner. "My sister has always been one to exaggerate her ailments. 'Tis one of her greatest pleasures." The doctor said, "For the sake of a safe and speedy recovery, she must remain abed." "Of course, you are correct. It is not every day that one takes such a perilous tumble, and there is her age to consider as well. But I confess myself rather uneasy over this entire scheme. Either I must delay my departure for London and suffer the neglect of my business prospects, or I must arouse my sister from her sick-bed and risk exacerbating her condition."
"I do not know that we have a choice, Mr. Gardiner," said his wife. "The doctor has ordered bed rest. My sister cannot be removed, which obliges us to delay our departure."
"Well, there is another alternative," said Darcy, who theretofore had been a silent observer. All eyes turned toward him. He cleared his throat. "There is no reason to remove Mrs. Bennet from Pemberley and risk her health. I shall assume responsibility for seeing Miss Bennet and her mother safely back to Hertfordshire when the timing suits." Mr. Gardiner put forth the usual protest one might expect of a scheme, in which all the benefits rebounded to himself and all the inconvenience to the younger man, but in the end it was his suspicion that Mr. Darcy, who seemed a decent, honourable man, had another interest in the affair. Else the older man would not have yielded. Later, Elizabeth was in her mother's room. Mrs. Bennet had finally dozed off to sleep, affording her daughter the perfect opportunity to dwell on the events of the day, and how, despite his having saved her mother's life, Mr. Darcy must be mortified to be entertaining such people for an extended stay. Thoughts of his feelings towards not just her mother, but also all her family, intruded on her equanimity. "Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections? To congratulate myself on the hope of relations whose condition in life is so decidedly beneath my own?" Such was the question he had posed during their heated exchange at the parsonage house. His letter gave further proof of his disdain. "The situation of your mother's family was nothing in comparison to that total want of propriety so frequently, so almost uniformly betrayed by herself, by your 3 younger sisters, and occasionally even by your father. Pardon me, it pains me to offend you, but amidst your concern for the defects of your nearest relations, and your displeasure at this representation of them, let it give you consolation to consider that to have conducted yourselves so as to avoid any share of the like censure is praise no less generally bestowed on you and your elder sister than it is honourable to the sense and disposition of both." At least his disdain did not extend towards Jane. In principle, however, certainly not in practice. Indeed, he had been the means of separating Jane and Mr. Bingley, and he had done nothing to amend his actions. Surely if he has told Mr. Bingley that Jane truly did love him, Mr. Bingley would have returned for her, Elizabeth considered. Over the course of the next several days, she would endeavour to find out. Elizabeth decided to venture to the library in search of reading material before returning to her room for the evening. The last thing she meant to do was burden Mr. Darcy with the task of entertaining an uninvited guest. How awkward she then felt when she encountered him just outside the library. He swept a bow and said, "Miss Elizabeth, I trust your mother is finding everything to her satisfaction." Somewhat comforted that Mr. Darcy did not seem to bear her mother any ill will for an accident that might easily have been avoided had she been paying attention to where she was going, an ill-timed accident that was the means for Elizabeth remaining in Mr. Darcy's company for who knew how long, she half smiled. "Indeed." "And is she enjoying the flowers? I believe Mrs. Reynolds had them specially arranged, based upon your mother's remarking about how much she enjoyed seeing them in the East Garden." "I cannot allow your kindness to my mother to go unnoticed. At this rate she may never wish to leave her apartment." Elizabeth arched her brow. "Or is that your intention, sir?" "No, not at all." "Well, you may think better of such caring attention, for it may be the means of delaying her recovery. What's more, she may never wish to leave Pemberley. I believe your mother is much too fond of her beloved Longbourn to wish to stay away too long." "I would not be too certain of that, were I you, sir." "What about you, Miss Elizabeth? Are you eager to be away from Pemberley?" "Sir, what sort of question is that? If I say yes or no, you might misinterpret my motives. Rather than allow for such a possibility, perhaps I might simply remark on the beauty of your home, for indeed I have never seen a place for which nature has done more, or where natural beauty has been so little counteracted by an awkward taste." He smiled. "I'm glad you approve." "Are you laughing at me, sir?" "Indeed I am not. Your good opinion is so rarely bestowed, and that you would express it so willingly about my home indeed makes me happy." "And what about you, sir? If your travels last year are any indication, will you not soon be away from Pemberley?" "Last year was a particular case. It's not often that one's friend lets a large estate and requires instruction on its management. That being said, it is my greatest wish that I should spend this autumn here in Derbyshire, as I had planned when we were together in Kent," he thought but did not say. The disappointed look in his eyes pained her. Her eyes moist with emotion, Elizabeth said, "I'm sorry to have made you so miserable, sir." "You need not apologise. Any disappointment I may have suffered I fear is of my own doing. I came to you with every expectation of a favourable reply. You taught me a lesson, hard indeed at first, but most advantageous. By you I was properly humbled. I came to you without a doubt of my reception. You showed me how insufficient were all my pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased. Darcy then apologised for his terrible proposal, and concluded his speech by asking, "Will you give me leave to make amends?" "I believe it is I who should be apologising to you. You see, sir, I am beginning to suspect my mother's accident. Indeed, her being here is part of an elaborate scheme. I believe she may have overheard my telling Jane about what unfolded between us in Kent, which is in and of itself a problem because it's a breach of etiquette, one I ought not to have committed." Darcy said, "I know how close you and your sister are. I did not expect you to keep it a secret from her." Elizabeth said, "I fear once Mamma learned what happened, she kept that knowledge to herself and instead contrived to play matchmaker." "You owe me no apology. How can I object to your mother's scheme when it has been the means of your being here at Pemberley?" "You do not feel that you've been manipulated by an over-eager mamma?" The matter of his imminent guests immediately sprang to his mind. Miss Elizabeth, as you know, my sister will arrive tomorrow. What I have failed to mention is there will be others arriving at Pemberley as well." Elizabeth received the news with mixed emotions. "Mr. Bingley?" she asked, hoping that if such were indeed the case, his pernicious sisters Mrs. Louisa Hurst and Miss Caroline Bingley would not be coming as well. "No, not Bingley," he replied. "My guests will be a Lord and Lady Davenport with their 2 daughters." After bidding Elizabeth good evening and walking away, the import of what he had just told her struck him. A chill washed over him. How might I even dream of paying court to either of Lord Davenport's daughters now, when the woman I had planned to spend the rest of my life with is staying under the same roof with me in my beloved home? Chapter 5. His particular guests. Darcy knew exactly what he was about in allowing himself to be persuaded to have the Davenports at Pemberley as his particular guests for the best part of the summer. Ignoring the girls' daughters was not an option. He had always been the consummate gentleman where they were concerned. He could not possibly behave otherwise now. He would not. An uncanny confluence of events caused the Davenports to arrive earlier than scheduled, even before Georgiana arrived from Matlock. Whereas Darcy had supposed his cousin Richard would be escorting his sister and her companion, Mrs. Annesley, to Pemberley, such was not the case. His uncle, Lord Matlock, had sent an urgent message conveying that a male servant would be accompanying the ladies in his second eldest son's stead. An amiable gentleman who fell readily into conversation wherever he went, Richard would have been an excellent diversion for Lady Althea, Lady Bethany, or even both. Darcy recalled how exceedingly well Elizabeth and his cousin got along in Kent. Specifically, he recalled her habit of teasing him at the slightest bit of encouragement from Richard. "Your cousin will give you a very pretty notion of me, and teach you not to believe a word I say. I am particularly unlucky in meeting such a person so able to expose my real character in a part of the world where I had hoped to pass myself off with some degree of credit. Indeed, Mr. Darcy, it is very ungenerous in you to mention all that you knew to my disadvantage in Hertfordshire, and, give me leave to say, very impolitic too, for it is provoking me to retaliate, and such things may come out as will shock your relations to hear." "I'm not afraid of you," said he smilingly. "Pray, let me hear what you have to accuse him of," cried Colonel Fitzwilliam. "I should like to know how he behaves among strangers." "You shall hear then. But prepare yourself for something very dreadful. The first time of my ever seeing him in Hertfordshire, you must know, was at a ball, and at this ball, what do you think he did? He danced only 4 dances, though gentlemen were scarce, and, to my certain knowledge, more than one young lady was sitting down in want of a partner. Mr. Darcy, you cannot deny the fact." "I had not at that time the honour of knowing any lady in the assembly beyond my own party." "True, and nobody can ever be introduced in a ballroom. Well, Colonel Fitzwilliam, what do I play next? My fingers wait your orders."
"Perhaps," said Darcy. "I should have judged better, had I sought an introduction, but I am ill-qualified to recommend myself to strangers." "Shall we ask your cousin the reason of this?" said Elizabeth, still addressing Colonel Fitzwilliam. "Shall we ask him why a man of sense and education, and who has lived in the world, is ill-qualified to recommend himself to strangers?" "I can answer your question," said Fitzwilliam, "without applying to him. It is because he will not give himself the trouble." His taunting reverie sufficiently persuaded Darcy that, were his cousin to arrive, there was a better chance that Elizabeth would command the greater share of his attention and he hers. No, it was just as well that Richard did not come. While greeting his guests, Lord and Lady Davenport and their two lovely daughters, Lady Althea and Lady Bethany, only one thought was uppermost in Darcy's mind. Did I give up too easily on my heart's greatest desire, to spend the rest of my days with Elizabeth? Shall I wait for the doors to her heart to open and let me in? I want her. I need her. I love her. Do I not owe it to myself to wait a while longer? Less than a half-hour later, Darcy sat in the drawing-room with his guests. Mrs. Reynolds had seen to it that they were settled in record time. All that was missing was his sister, who was to preside over his table. Darcy glanced at the clock. Elizabeth was not in the room either. In fact, he had not seen her all morning. Lively and light-hearted, Lady Bethany was not one to sit idly for very long. Her flawless skin, her perfect symmetry of form, and her youthful vitality all combined to make her not easily ignored by anyone. "Mr. Darcy," she said, "I should love a walk in the park while we await Miss Darcy's arrival. What say you?" Before Darcy could fashion a reply, Lady Bethany's mother, Lady Charlotte, said, "What a splendid idea, my dear. I say we all have a turn around the park. It will be a refreshing change of attitude after sitting in the carriage for so long this morning." By Lady Bethany's expression, she was not in favour of her mother's scheme. She truly meant to have Darcy all to herself. Lord Davenport said, "I must beg to be excused from the exertion. Unlike you ladies, I spent a fair amount of time on horseback this morning. I would much rather remain inside and avail myself of more of Darcy's fine liquor. You do not mind, do you, Darcy?" Darcy said, "Oh, not at all, my lord." With that, Darcy and the ladies stood and prepared to be on their way. Lady Bethany would not be entirely denied. She laced her arm through Darcy's, and the four of them quit the house. They had not walked far before Darcy espied Elizabeth walking in their direction. Excusing himself, he hurried towards her. "Miss Bennet, what a pleasure it is to see you this morning." "Thank you, sir. I've been enjoying your lovely gardens." He smiled. "I take it that they meet with your approval?" She returned his smile. "And very willingly bestowed," she responded, a hint of playfulness in her voice. By now the three ladies had joined them, and introductions were made all round, according to the usual civilities. Darcy said, "My guests wish to enjoy a turn around the park while we await my sister's arrival. Will you join us?" "No," Elizabeth said abruptly. "What I mean to say is, I was about to return to the house to sit with my mother. Perhaps I shall have the privilege of joining you later." "I shall count on it," Darcy said. When Elizabeth was gone, the Countess said, "I was unaware that there were others in our country party, sir." Darcy said, "Yes, well, Miss Bennet's being here is purely by chance." Lady Bethany said, "I'm sure Mr. Darcy's other house guests can mean nothing at all to any of us." She resumed her former attitude with the gentleman. "Shall we carry on, sir? I'm eager to see all there is to see of your magnificent grounds." By the time they returned to the manor house, Miss Georgiana Darcy had arrived. Having made the Davenports' acquaintance when they dined at Darcy House in May, she fell into conversation with them with the readiness of old acquaintances. Little over an hour after Georgiana arrived, Darcy received a most unexpected guest. It was his aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She showed Darcy's particular guests, the Davenports, as much civility as her suspicions over the reason for their being at Pemberley would allow. I have been visiting friends in the north, and I decided to conclude my travels with a visit to the Earl and his wife in Matlock before returning to Kent," she had explained as her reason for calling on Darcy so unexpectedly. When she could, she begged for a private audience with her nephew, to which he readily conceded. Once settled in the leather armchair across from Darcy's large mahogany desk, she said, "Something told me I ought to call on you here at Pemberley, nephew." She nodded her regal head. "Indeed, it is a good thing I followed my intuition. I fear my young niece may be beyond her depth in attempting to preside over your table with such a large and noble party. My Anne and I are more than happy to remain at Pemberley for as long as the Davenports are here. I assure you that such a sacrifice on your part is entirely unnecessary. You ought to welcome my gesture. Who better than me to stay and protect you from the likes of the Davenports? You cannot be at a loss as to the reason for their being here." "I know perfectly well why they are here, your ladyship. They are, after all, my guests. As Lord Davenport was one of my father's closest friends, he and his family are always welcome at Pemberley." She reared her head. "Old family ties are of no excuse for your having knowingly invited a scheming, matchmaking mamma with 2 single daughters, both in want of husbands, into your home. What on earth are you thinking? Or have you taken leave of your senses?" "Lady Catherine, I am well aware of my duties to Pemberley, to beget an heir. You cannot be surprised that I am not opposed to marrying. When you and I last spoke, you were adamantly opposed to the idea. Being opposed to marrying my cousin is not quite the same as objecting to marriage altogether." Darcy wanted no part in a repeat performance the likes of which he'd suffered the last time he and his aunt had spoken on the matter of his not marrying Anne. However, Lady Catherine's parting words, as he escorted her and his cousin Anne to their awaiting carriage, came as no surprise to him. "I am not finished with this matter, nephew. I am not one to suffer disappointment without a fight. You have not heard the last from me on this issue." Chapter 6. Wilfully Misunderstood. A flash of yellow in the lane up ahead caught Lady Catherine's eye, and for a moment she thought she espied Miss Elizabeth Bennet. "That is strange," said Lady Catherine to no one in particular. Miss Anne de Bourgh regarded her mother curiously. Lady Catherine waved her hand dismissively. Moments later, her ladyship saw a young woman dressed in a yellow gown standing on the side of the lane, waiting for the carriage to pass. "This is not to be borne." Lady Catherine banged on the roof of the carriage, commanding the driver's attention. Once the carriage came to a stop, one of the postilions dutifully assisted her ladyship to the ground, and she slowly ambled towards the place in which the young woman was still standing. "I thought it was you, Miss Bennet. You were a long way from Hertfordshire. What in heavens are you doing here at Pemberley?" Elizabeth curtsied. "Your ladyship?" "I asked what you are doing here. Surely you have not attached yourself to my nephew in a shameful alliance that would mark your family as well as yourself with disgrace and dishonour, and must very well render you all laughing-stocks." Her stomach tightened. Her voice elevated, she said, "How dare you accuse me of something so scandalous?" Her ladyship narrowed her eyes. "How else does one explain your being here?" Elizabeth would not have dignified such a question with an answer under other circumstances, but in this case she decided it was the easiest way to put an end to the interview and see the elderly woman on her way. "If you must know, your ladyship, I am here in Derbyshire with my mother. While touring Mr. Darcy's grounds, my mother met with a mishap that has rendered her incapacitated." "A likely story indeed. I saw no evidence of your mother being here." "Your powers of observation do not render my story any less truthful." Her ladyship pursed her lips. "If your mother is indeed here, as you suggest, then where is she? Why did my nephew say nothing of having other guests beyond the Davenports?" "That is a question I'm afraid only your nephew is capable of answering." "I suppose your story is in keeping with what I have always suspected of you." "Pray, what is that supposed to mean?" asked Elizabeth, taking umbrage at her ladyship's remark. "I have no intention of quarrelling with you, Miss Bennet.
I always believed you to be a sensible woman, albeit a bit too impertinent for my taste. That is no reason you should not be useful to me."
Elizabeth arched her brow, but she said nothing. Relying heavily on her bejewelled walking stick, Lady Catherine laid one hand on the other.
"It did not escape my notice that my nephews were quite taken with you when we were all in Kent. It is to your credit that you did not use your feminine arts and allurements to entice one or the other of them to make you an offer of marriage. I'm afraid the same cannot be said of those two young ladies who now find themselves guests in Darcy's home. Since you are not swooning and preening owing to Darcy's attentions particularly, I will credit you with not being mercenary. However, I know all about your family. I know that neither you nor your sisters have any dowry to speak of. Perhaps I might be persuaded to take you under my wing in order that you might, one day, make something of yourself. Perhaps even attract the notice of a gentleman of higher means than you are otherwise capable of attracting. Of course, that would require something on your part to warrant such favour." Elizabeth could not discern where the elderly aristocrat was going with such talk. She was not sure she wanted to know, and thus she said nothing. "Well, say something. It is not every day that a young woman such as yourself meets with such an opportunity as I am suggesting." "Pray, what would your ladyship have me say?" "As I said, my nephew's attentions to you did not escape my notice. I know him well enough to know that he would never do anything to act upon said attentions, but that is not to say that either of those conniving Davenport daughters, or even their fortune-hunting parents, would not be persuaded that there is a greater reason for your being here. I trust you take my meaning." "I'm afraid your ladyship will have to be more specific." "Do not toy with me, young woman. You cannot be unaware that it is my favourite wish that Darcy and my Anne are one day to be married. I will not have my wishes denied by those scheming Davenports, even if they are of noble lineage. Darcy and Anne were fashioned for each other. It was decided between Darcy's mother, my dearly beloved sister, and me, that the cousins were to be joined in holy matrimony, that the fortunes of two grand estates would be combined as one." "What can any of this have to do with me? You and your sister did your part in planning the union. Its execution depends entirely upon Mr. Darcy and his cousin." "That is just the thing. My nephew asserts that he does not intend to marry my Anne, and now that I have seen him with the Davenport sisters, I begin to comprehend why he might have said as much. Well, I will not allow either of them to claim that which is Anne's. I am petitioning you to see that they do not." "What do you expect me to do?" "Make a pretence of being more to my nephew than you are. Once you've made a start, I imagine you'll do the job admirably. What respectable woman would wish for an alliance with a man who parades his mistress before them so openly, and entertains her in his home for all the world to see?" Elizabeth coloured. She stared. She said nothing. The turmoil in her mind was now painfully great. Her thoughts flew to the last time she had visited the haughty aristocrat in Kent, when she had wondered if she would ever see Lady Catherine without recollecting that, had she chosen it, she might have been presented to her as her future niece. Nor was she able to think, at that time, without a smile. What would she have said? How would she have behaved? Were questions with which she had amused herself. Now Elizabeth could only consider the woman standing before her with disgust, laced with a healthy measure of contempt. Her silence only encouraged Lady Catherine to continue speaking. "I see you are giving the matter a fair amount of thought, as well you should. As I said, I will make it very much worth your while." "You are mistaken, your ladyship, if you suppose I am seriously considering your scheme. For you to entertain such a notion indicates that you have wilfully misunderstood my character. Whom your nephew chooses to marry can be none of my business, nor is it any of yours for that matter. Now, as you've insulted me in every possible way, you and I can have nothing more to say to each other. Have a pleasant trip to wherever it is that you're going." With that, Elizabeth hastily walked away, not bothering even once to give Lady Catherine a curious look over her shoulder. Why, the audacity of that vicious woman! Later that day,
Elizabeth stood in the opulent hallway, just outside the drawing-room, smoothing her gown. Finally she was to meet Mr. Darcy's sister. She had heard so many things about Miss Darcy, what with Miss Bingley, singing the young woman's praises as being so very accomplished. Even Wickham's testimony had played a part in forming Elizabeth's opinion. Of course, she must now force herself to forget everything that gentleman had to say. After reading Mr. Darcy's letter, any thoughts since entertained about the young woman were accompanied by a pang of sympathy for her plight. What pained Elizabeth just as much was that she had been prepared to embrace Wickham's account so wholeheartedly, with little other than his word to substantiate his claims. Darcy abandoned his place by the mantelpiece and strode across the room to welcome Elizabeth when she entered. He smiled warmly. "Miss Elizabeth, I am delighted you've joined us. I've longed for the pleasure of introducing you to my sister." Before Darcy could finish his speech, a fair-haired, angelic creature was by his side. She dropped a polite curtsy, encouraging Elizabeth to do the same. "Miss Elizabeth, I'm so pleased to make your acquaintance." Here again Darcy smiled, his delight in his sister's eagerness evident. "My sister Georgiana," he interjected. When he smiled like that, Elizabeth could not help suffering a pinch of regret for ever having wounded him in the past. She returned his smile with one of her own. Directing all her attention to her new acquaintance, she said, "It is my pleasure to meet you as well." Georgiana said, "My brother spoke so fondly of you in all his letters from Hertfordshire. Indeed, he is very pleased that you are here." Nervous excitement was evident in the young lady's tone. An awkward second later she said, "I'm sorry your mother is feeling so poorly. I should like it very much if you will introduce us when she is able to receive visitors. I don't dare intrude upon her recovery." "I shall be happy to introduce you to my mother if that is your wish. I'm sure she will be honoured." The evening afforded Elizabeth her first opportunity to meet Mr. Darcy's other houseguest as well. A tall, haughty gentleman, who reeked of aristocracy, regarded her from head to toe with an odd look, prompting Elizabeth to recall her initial meeting with his wife earlier that day. The Countess had greeted Elizabeth with measured civility. Then, when Darcy introduced her to Lady Althea, the two young women had expressed their mutual pleasure in the honour of meeting each other. However, the reception of the other young woman, Lady Bethany, had not been nearly so pleasant. It was obvious to Elizabeth, at the time, that the tall, graceful younger woman was making a thorough assessment of her hair, her dress, and her jewellery. No doubt she found everything she saw wanting. "And these are the people with whom I am to spend the next several days?" Elizabeth thought. Darcy could not be more pleased with the first meeting between Elizabeth and Georgiana. He was relieved that Mrs. Bennet would soon see a full recovery, even if it did mean Elizabeth's reason for being there would soon be gone. Somewhere in the back of his mind was the hope that they would be persuaded to remain at Pemberley a while longer. He had promised Mr. Gardiner that he would see to their safe return to Hertfordshire. The last thing he wanted was to delegate such a privilege, even to his most trusted servant. However, the Davenports would remain at Pemberley for another month or so, which obliged Darcy not to leave until they were gone, and if some crisis dictated he leave, he must not be away for very long. As soon as Mrs. Bennet was sufficiently recovered, he would extend the offer to remain at Pemberley for a longer stay. Everything he knew about Elizabeth's character informed him that she would never dream of accepting such a proposal. Even now he sensed she had not grown accustomed to being there under the current conditions. Rather suspecting that Mrs. Bennet and he were allies of a sort, he was confident she could be easily persuaded to accept his invitation. Chapter 7. Akin to Wonderment. Experience had taught Darcy that a private audience with Elizabeth was best achieved during one of her early morning rambles. Just as he was wont to do in Kent, he set out on horseback in search of her. After a quarter of an hour, his diligence paid off when he espied her walking along a wooded path that bordered the lake's edge. He slid from his horse, tethered it to a nearby tree, and then proceeded in Elizabeth's direction. Upon seeing him walking her way, Elizabeth stopped and waited. She had hoped, rather than expected, she would see him that morning as well, away from his noble guests. Darcy bowed and said,
Pray you will pardon my intrusion upon what you may have meant to be a solitary commune with nature this morning, Miss Elizabeth.
I certainly do not mind at all, sir. I welcome your company. Doing otherwise would make me a most unappreciative, uninvited guest, would it not? Again, I beg of you not to dwell on the circumstances of your being here. You are most welcome at Pemberley any time you wish. You are very generous, sir. Darcy fell in step beside Elizabeth, and the two of them ambled along in silence. Feeling she ought to say something, anything to break the silence, she said, "I'd been meaning to ask, how do your friends Mr. Bingley and his family get along?" "When I last saw them in town, they were in health. I trust all your family as well?" "Indeed," said Elizabeth. How greatly she wanted to ask if he had been compelled to speak with his friend on Jane's behalf, but she did not know that she could without opening an old wound. Besides, if Mr. Bingley did care about her sister, would he not have returned to Hertfordshire by now? On the other hand, she had always been a curious creature. Her curiosity got the better of her intentions, and she heard herself say, "Sir, at the risk of introducing discontent, I would be entirely remiss if I did not ask if you spoke with Mr. Bingley about what you and I discussed in Kent?" I'm afraid I did not tell him anything about my time spent in Kent. My omission was not from want of opportunity, but from my refusal to broach any topic that might remind me of how things unfolded between us. Although you may very well deem my reasoning as wanting, this is my only excuse. I do not know that I can fault you entirely in that, for it was a long time before I said anything to Jane, and when I did, I omitted any mention of Mr. Bingley. Darcy's explanation of why he had done what he did then came to mind. Your sister I also watched. Her look and manners were open, cheerful, and engaging as ever, but without any symptom of peculiar regard. And I remained convinced from the evening's scrutiny that though she received his attentions with pleasure, she did not invite them by any participation of sentiment. If you have not been mistaken here, I must have been in error. Your superior knowledge of your sister must make the latter probable. If it be so, if I have been misled by such error to inflict pain on her, your resentment has not been unreasonable. But I shall not scruple to assert that the serenity of your sister's countenance and air was such as might have given the most acute observer a conviction that, however amiable her temper, her heart was not likely to be easily touched. Furthermore, I wish for you to know that I bear you no ill will as regards my sister's broken heart. You are not to be blamed for failing to read in Jane's actions that which her temperament allowed her to conceal from everyone save those who know her best. I know that I ought not to have interfered, but I can't say that, had I to do it again, I would have thought differently. I would hope, however, that my behaviour would have been different. I had no right. I should like to think my thoughts, as well as my behaviour, would have been different regarding the other matter of contentiousness that once existed between us. You must think me very foolish to have believed a word Mr. Wickham had to say against you. Wickham is a master of deceptive charm. I do not blame you for not seeing it. I blame myself enough for both of us, I assure you. How may I make amends? As we both are of a mind of being in the other's debt, what say you we consider ourselves even? Darcy took Elizabeth by the hand. All our mistakes of the past shall be forgotten, and only our present and future deeds shall be the basis for a new understanding between us. He raised her hand to his lips and gently kissed her knuckles. The brush of his lips against her skin sent scintillating waves throughout her body. She tore her eyes from his hand, gently caressing hers, and met his, dark and passionate, with a mixture of brooding laced with longing, imploring. "Do we have an agreement?" Darcy asked, his voice tender. The last time they had been standing this close, and looking at each other this way, she'd felt something akin to wonderment amid her fury over his ill-timed, ill-worded avowal of his ardent admiration for her. He had been that close to kissing her. Every fibre of her being had informed her of as much. Her lips slightly parted, her eyes broke away from his, and fell to his lips, moist and intoxicatingly inviting. Closing her mouth and biting her lower lip, she ran her tongue along its edge just so, in preparation for what might very well be her first kiss ever. And not just by any man, but this man. This man who occupied her thoughts more than she dared to confess to anyone, even herself. This man who now stood closer to her than he had ever stood before. Another glance into his eye reminded her that she had not yet replied. "Yes," she said. "Yes," she said again as though answering a yet unasked question. The steady clip-clopping of a horse's hooves drew them apart. He released her hand. Moments later it was necessary to welcome a third to what had been an intimate party of two, when, sitting astride a beautiful bay, Lady Bethany joined Darcy and Elizabeth. Darcy bowed slightly. "Lady Bethany." The young woman only had eyes for the gentleman. Her voice, sweet and feminine, she said, "Sir, I've been waiting for you in the stables, and I was forced to ride out to see what had become of you." "Excuse me?" The comely brunette pouted a little. "Why, sir, you do remember your promise that we would go riding this morning, do you not?" Darcy could not rightly say that he did remember, but he was too much of a gentleman to deny her claim. He turned to Elizabeth. "Would you care to join us, Miss Elizabeth? Nothing would please me more." "Oh, sir, I do not dare intrude upon what is meant to be a private engagement." "I'm sure Lady Bethany will not mind." He looked at the other woman, still sitting on her horse. "You won't mind if Miss Elizabeth joins us?" By her undisguised, annoyed expression, she surely did mind. Before the young woman could protest, Elizabeth said, "Sir, I would much rather return to the house to attend my mother. I fear I have been gone longer than I had planned." She half smiled. "Perhaps another time." "I shall hold you to it," said Darcy. Elizabeth then went away in the direction of the house, heedless of what the other two were doing. Her mind was busily engaged with what might have happened had Mr. Darcy and she not been interrupted, and the possibilities thereafter. Later she was sitting alone in the library when Darcy joined her. Looking up from her book, Elizabeth smiled warmly and said, "How was your ride, sir? I wager it would have been far more pleasurable had you accepted my invitation to join us." "I doubt you would feel that way had I indeed accepted your kind offer." He took the seat closest to hers. "Why would you say such a thing?" "The truth is, sir, I'm no horsewoman. I never ride horseback. I leave that particular pleasure to Jane." He frowned a little. "Is there a particular reason you eschew the endeavour?" Elizabeth shrugged. "I simply never gave myself the trouble of learning to ride." "Pray you will take the trouble of learning while you're here at Pemberley, for I will be more than happy to teach you." "I do not know that Lady Bethany will be able to spare you long enough for such a time-consuming endeavour. It would be remiss of you to neglect one of your guests in favour of the other." "About that," Darcy said, and cleared his throat. "I would never have invited the Davenports to Pemberley had I known you'd be here." She gazed into his eyes tentatively. "How could you have known?" "I suppose neither of us could have imagined it." Darcy was about to say more, but they were soon joined by the elder Davenport daughter, Lady Althea. After acknowledging the room's occupants in the usual way, the young woman busied herself by perusing the shelves lining the walls. At length, she would not be satisfied until she had claimed the greater share of Darcy's attention by insisting he assist her in locating a book that they had been discussing in London. Reluctantly abandoning his seat, he stood and walked over to her. "What book was that, Lady Althea?" "Oh, you know the one. It was one of Shelley's. You said you'd recently acquired it." Her interest piqued. Elizabeth all but laid her book aside. She suffered sentiments eerily enough of the same kind as those she felt during those days spent at Netherfield during Jane's convalescence last autumn. "I do recall. I believe I left it in town," said Darcy. "Had I known you would leave it behind at the townhouse, I should have insisted on borrowing it when I last dined there with you." Of course they had dined together and on more than a few occasions, but they were not nearly so intimate as she made it seem. Darcy glanced at Elizabeth, half embarrassed, half apologetic for Lady Althea's impolitic remark. "I'll be sure to amend my lapse when we are once again at Darcy House," Lady Althea continued. "I will be more than happy to acquire a copy for your reading pleasure while you are here." "Oh, I could never ask such a thing of you, sir. I'm more than happy to suspend my pleasure until you and I are in town. Although I would be remiss were I not to thank you properly for your willingness to attend to my pleasures so ardently." She laced her arm through Darcy's and commenced coaxing him away. "What shall be your reward?" "No reward is necessary, I assure you." "But I insist upon returning your kind gesture, sir. Perhaps I shall grant you a private exhibition. The music room was empty when I passed by the open door. Let us adjourn there now." As if remembering there was a third party in the room, she glanced back at Elizabeth. "Surely you do not mind if I borrow a moment of Mr. Darcy's time?" Darcy said, "Pray join us, Miss Elizabeth. It has been many months since I enjoyed listening to you exhibit. Nothing would bring me more pleasure." "Oh, I should never dream of it, sir. Some things are best enjoyed by two. Surely a private exhibition is one of them." "There, you see, sir, I believe Miss Elizabeth and I understand each other perfectly well, do we not?" she said to Elizabeth. "I should say so," replied Elizabeth, "perfectly well." Watching Lady Althea and Darcy quit the room was a cause for some consternation on Elizabeth's part. Such blatant flirtation was beyond the pale. No one dared argue that Mr. Darcy was not a most desirable man, even if she felt herself slow in realizing it. However, seeing him thus pursued was startling indeed. Miss Caroline Bingley's behaviour in Hertfordshire last autumn was nothing compared to Lady Althea's and Lady Bethany's. A chord of disquiet echoed throughout her busy mind as she considered that Darcy's dismissiveness toward Miss Bingley was nowhere to be discerned when it came to his attitude toward the Davenport sisters. Where Mr. Darcy is concerned, those two young ladies are no Caroline Bingleys. Chapter 8. All That Glisters. The Davenport sisters were always competing with each other for one thing or another. Separated in age by fewer than 2 years, their rivalry over Mr. Darcy's affections would be no different. Having argued between themselves on the terms of engagement, they resolved that, when it came to such matters as who would be the next mistress of Pemberley, there were no rules. May the better woman win, they politely acquiesced over tea. The next day, when Darcy and Lady Bethany were enjoying a leisurely walk around the park, she said, "Sir, I hope you do not subscribe to the sentiment that a younger sister should not be married before the eldest?" "I cannot say that I do." She then clung a little tighter to his arm. "You do not know how much it pleases me to hear you say that." Thoughts of his own conduct in offering his hand to Elizabeth came to mind. If events had unfolded as he had planned, she would be married before her elder sister. Pleasurable thoughts of what it would have been like if she had accepted him soon filled his head. Elizabeth would be the one on my arm, sharing a leisurely stroll around the park. Elizabeth would be sharing my home with me, my bed. In time there would be children, a son and heir, and a younger son as well, and daughters, who were as charming and witty as their mother. Our life at Pemberley would be perfect, everything life was meant to be. "Mr. Darcy?" The soft call of his name shook him from his reverie. "Yes," he responded. "Yes, the sky is the loveliest shade of green you've ever seen, or yes, as in you've not heard a word I've said?" "I beg your pardon, Lady Bethany." "Oh, I shall forgive you just this one time, but only if you will indulge me." "What would you like for me to do?" "You simply must tell me what has you so preoccupied this morning." "What indeed?" There could only be one thing, or rather one person on his mind. Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Where is she? What is she doing? Is she enjoying one of her solitary rambles? Shall I expect to see her at any moment? Dare I wish it? Is she attending her mother? Perhaps she is tucked away in the library, with her lovely head buried in a book. You are correct. I have been distracted. However, the precise cause is not something I am at liberty to discuss. I promise you my undivided attention from this moment forward. Will that do? I suppose it will have to for now. Mind you, Mr. Darcy, I promise to exact a more fitting retribution at my leisure. You, sir, have been forewarned, she said teasingly. Later that very afternoon, Darcy found himself engaged in a similar conversation with Lady Althea. The two of them were walking along the water's edge, enjoying nature's summer medley, when out of nowhere her ladyship said, "Sir, it is commonly held that it is improper for a younger sister to be married before the eldest. As for myself, I find it unthinkable." I recall having a discussion along these lines with Lady Bethany. "And what did you say?" she began with passion. In a less eager tone she added, "If I might ask." "I'm afraid my views on the matter differ from yours." "I suppose you must think me terribly old-fashioned in my thinking on the subject. Therein lies the difference between my younger sister and me. I have always been the more sensible, dare I say the fastidious one. My sister is very spoiled. She likes to have her own way. However, once she gets what she wants, as she very often does, she is never quite contented, and it is never very long before she has her eyes on the next conquest, if you will. Such liveliness of spirit makes for quite a bit of excitement, even passion. But those things fade." She arched her brow. "No doubt you take my meaning, sir?" Darcy said nothing to indicate that he agreed with her. What healthy young man did not desire passion and excitement? "I think I know you well enough to know you want something more substantial, sir. Something that is capable of standing the test of time." The younger Davenport daughter sought Darcy out in his study the next day. Standing to welcome her, he said, "Lady Bethany, how can I be of service to you?" "I can think of any number of things you can do, sir. No doubt you would too, if you would but put your mind to it." After regarding the young beauty from head to toe, he said, "I trust you're enjoying your stay here at Pemberley?" She moved closer to where he stood. "I am indeed, but I am always quite determined to be contented wherever I must be. Unlike my sister, who I have often heard say that she enjoys nothing better than being at our home in Staffordshire. There's little wonder she has not found her husband." "Love of one's own home is a virtue, is it not?" "Certainly it's more of a gentleman's prerogative. A woman's place is by her husband's side. She must find her contentment where he finds his." Darcy laughed a little. "Surely you do not believe a word of what you're saying?" She feigned astonishment. "You doubt me, sir? Or do you suppose you know me so well?" They were now within inches of each other. "I think I know you well enough." "Well enough for what, sir?" "Well enough to know you enjoy professing opinions that are not always your own." It did not escape him that he had said words of a similar vein to Elizabeth when they were in Kent. It was one of the things he admired most about her. An admirable trait indeed. "I will allow that to be true only if you will allow that I also know you very well. I know that you like fencing, horseback riding, and travelling. I know that you like to say you detest dancing, and you never do so when you can help it. But having enjoyed my fair share of dances with you in town, I must say you do it very well. Indeed, these are but a few of the reasons I am your most ardent admirer." Darcy said nothing to encourage the young woman's praise. It did occur to him, however, that she was a most determined flirt. "It is your turn, sir?" "My turn?" "Yes, I remarked on those things that I appreciate most about you. You ought to tell me what you admire most about me." I don't know that it would be wise of me." "Oh, sir, but you must. Else I should think you do not like me at all, that you prefer my sister to me, and then I shall be ever so heartbroken. Surely you would not want to break my little old heart, Mr. Darcy?"
"Lady Bethany?" She gasped.
"You hate me." "No, I could never hate you." "You like me?"
"I do."
"Do you admire me?"
"I admire you."
"What do you admire about me?"
"I admire many things about you."
"Name one," she said.
"I admire your light-heartedness. Will that do?"
I suppose it's a start. Because you've been ever so kind in submitting to my first inquiry, there is another question I would ask."
"What is that?"
"How much do you admire me?" She playfully seized his hands, lifted them, and positioned them inches apart. "Would you say you admire me as much as this?" Darcy drew apart his hands a bit more. "Oh, at least this much." "Ah, sir, dare I hope you admire me this much?" she asked, spreading his hands, and hence his arms, further apart. Sensing the danger of Lady Bethany's little game, he tore his hands from her light grip and clutched them behind his back. This defensive manoeuvre was well timed indeed. Before Lady Bethany could protest, the door swung open, and in waltzed Lady Althea. If she noticed how close her sister was standing to Darcy, she did not mention it. Turning to face the elder sister, Darcy gave her a little bow and said, "Lady Althea?" "Mr. Darcy, please forgive my tardiness. I trust my little sister kept you well diverted while you waited for me to join you."
"I beg your pardon?"
"Pray you haven't forgotten that you and I are engaged." A chord of panic struck him, and then he recalled he had promised to accompany Lady Althea into Lambton that afternoon. Rather, he had been persuaded to accompany her. The Davenport daughters were nothing if not persistent. "Of course," he replied. "I shall see that the carriage is readied for our departure." "You need not bother, sir. I have already arranged it." Darcy turned to Lady Bethany. "Will you be joining us?" "That would be lovely, except that the curricle will hardly allow for 3. However, Sarah is expecting to trail behind us on horseback, Bethany. You're welcome to ride along beside her," Lady Althea said. Sarah was a maid whose job it was to chaperone the sisters. Lady Bethany offered Darcy her hand. "Our little tete-a-tete has been most enlightening, sir. I look forward to picking up exactly where we left off upon your return." Robbing her of the pleasure of any manner of affection that might harm her sister, Darcy half bowed over her hand. As usual, when Darcy and Lady Althea commenced one of their sojourns, a comfortable silence always accompanied them. As was her wont to do, Lady Althea was also the first to break it. "I can't help thinking I ought to be thanking you for appeasing my little sister, sir," she said. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" "What would you call it?" "Both you and your sister are guests in my home. I would no more neglect her than I would you." "You say that as though you consider us, what is the word? I don't know, interchangeable? I am sorry I have given you that impression." "Then it is fair to say that you do not regard my sister and me as such. Rather you appreciate that each of us has our own way of thinking and feeling." "I am very much aware of the differences between the two of you," said Darcy. "Then I do not need to remind you of the often quoted line in Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice, 'All that glisters is not gold'?" Chapter 9. A Delicate Nature. Later on, the Davenport sisters were bickering once again when their mother swept into the room. She blew a frustrated breath. "I wish you two would relinquish this foolish sibling rivalry, and instead focus on the common good." "Mother, it is only proper that I should be the one whom Mr. Darcy chooses. I am older," cried Lady Althea. "By fewer than 2 years, and even that one would never know, for you are such a prude. Why, just this morning Mr. Darcy was remarking on how much he admires me for my liveliness. Dare I neglect to mention that I am also more beautiful as well as more accomplished than you are?" "Enough!" Lady Davenport exclaimed. "You are both equally beautiful and equally accomplished." Ignoring their mother, the girls continued arguing between themselves. Lady Althea said, "I wager any such confession from the gentleman was not put forth without a fair amount of prodding on your part. Is there any wonder he was so relieved when I entered the room?" Lord Davenport then joined them in time to hear the last retort. "I've had enough squabbling from the two of you. You both enjoy a most advantageous situation. Do not ruin it." He took a seat and commenced lighting his pipe. "Surely I cannot be the only one in our party to notice how Darcy attends his other guest. I dare say he barely remembers anyone else is in the room when she is about." "Miss Elizabeth Bennet? Surely you jest," exclaimed his wife. "She is so brown and coarse. Why, I dare say one would have to look very hard to find any beauty in her features. As best I can discern, she has no fortune and no connections." The proud aristocrat huffed. What might Mr. Darcy possibly see in her when he might have his choice of either of our girls? After dinner, Elizabeth escorted her mother into the drawing-room. This was Mrs. Bennet's first time meeting Mr. Darcy's illustrious guests. Elizabeth's emotions were all aflutter. She was glad that her mother was so much recovered as to allow for time in company, but she was very much dreading what her mother, who was at times vulgar, might say or do. "Have your daughter's governesses left them?" Lady Davenport asked Mrs. Bennet soon after they were introduced. "My daughters had no governesses." "5 daughters and not one governess between them? Have they attended seminary?" "No, I cannot say that they have." "Then who taught them? Who attended to them? Without a governess, their educations must have been neglected." "Compared with some families, I believe they were, but those who wished to learn never wanted the means. They were always encouraged to read and had all the masters that were necessary. Those who choose to be idle certainly might." "Why, you poor, poor dear! I find I am in great awe of you, madam. How dearly you must suffer the burden that the chances of your daughters finding gentlemen of consideration in the world are next to impossible. You have my sympathies." "I do not know that I deserve such sentiments, your ladyship. It is true that none of my 5 daughters is married, but I assure you it is not from want of opportunity. A fine young man from town courted my Jane when she was but 15. She is the true beauty in the family. He wrote some very lovely verses on her, I seem to recall," she said wistfully. "Then again, there was another young gentleman from town who let a neighbouring estate, who was so much in love with my eldest that I was sure he was going to make her an offer. But then he went away before he had the chance." As if concerned that the lack of substance in her assertions undermined rather than bolstered her argument, Mrs. Bennet then said, "And my Lizzie has turned down more than one proposal of marriage over the past year, I am sure. She might have married the heir of Longbourn had she pleased." Here Elizabeth looked at the 2 sisters, and saw them making signs of derision at each other, and at Darcy, whose expression was imperturbably grave. How impolitic for her mother to say such a thing. She didn't know what was worse, his knowing that he had not been the only man whose hand she had refused, or that he had offered his hand to the same woman as that ridiculous Mr. Collins. Mrs. Bennet said, "Why, she might have been mistress of a home as fine as all this, had she been of a mind to." Elizabeth felt the colour spread over her body, and in this instance she could not bring herself to look at Mr. Darcy. She heard Lady Davenport exclaim, "Do you mean to suggest that your daughter spurned the hand of a gentleman who might have offered her a home as grand as Pemberley? Surely you jest." Mrs. Bennet shrugged. "I state nothing but the truth. However, as I am not one to speak out of turn on matters of such a delicate nature, I shall not venture to say more on the subject." Not knowing how to think or how to feel, Elizabeth ran her hand along the velvety upholstered settee. She had dreaded what might happen when her mother was well enough to come downstairs for an evening. She had rightfully suspected that, with or without sufficient encouragement, the evening would quickly descend into an exhibition of the duelling matchmaking mammas. The sooner mamma and I are away from Pemberley, the better. For now there was nothing to do but suffer through it, and hope and pray her mother would hold her tongue for the rest of the evening. A frightening thought occurred to her. What if her mother could be prodded into telling all she knew about the disastrous marriage proposal to Mr. Darcy's guests? Knowing what she now knew, that her reasons for rejecting Mr. Darcy's proposal were based on misperceptions and lies, people would think she was the silliest girl in all of England to have given up so much. How relieved she was when she heard Mr. Darcy ask his sister to exhibit, and everyone's attention was thus diverted. Later, when Elizabeth and her mother were alone, Elizabeth's frustration would not be repressed. "Mamma, it is entirely improper that you should discuss such intimate details in front of people so wholly unconnected to us." Mrs. Bennet's eyes widened. "What did I say that was untrue?" "It is not a matter of truthfulness. It is entirely inappropriate to boast of anyone having rejected a respectable man's hand in marriage." "I dare say the greater sin is rejecting a respectable man's hand in marriage from the start. But the deed is done." She rested her hands on her hips. "Through my contrivances, you've been given a chance to fix your mistake. You must use this time at Pemberley to your greatest advantage by doing everything in your power
to secure Mr. Darcy before it is too late." Elizabeth folded one arm over the other. "Mamma, you and I will not have this discussion. Not here, not now, and not ever." "I assure you, Miss Lizzie, I am not telling you anything that Lady Davenport is not telling her daughters. Either of those young women would jump at the chance to be mistress of all this. You must not underestimate your competition." Chapter 10. Time and Distance. Their mutual tendency to be early risers afforded Darcy and Elizabeth their best opportunity to spend time in each other's company without the Davenports. However, as the Davenports' purpose in being at Pemberley was so painfully obvious, such occasions were now a cause for uneasiness on Elizabeth's part. She was alone in the breakfast parlour when Mr. Darcy walked in. "How are you this morning, Miss Elizabeth?" He took his usual seat at the table. "Did you mean to ask, how am I withstanding my mamma's exhibition last evening? Pray, how can I make amends?" "No, but since you broached the subject, you ought to know that I do not bear you any ill feelings because of anything that your mother did, or rather did not, say." Elizabeth said, "Oh, Mr. Darcy, after last evening I cannot help but feel even more like an intruder." Darcy said, "I wish you wouldn't. Regardless of the circumstances that led you here, surely you must know that having you here means the world to me. I've imagined you being here for so long. It feels right." "Sir, it is very kind of you to say. To own the truth, I confess that a great measure of my discomfort has to do with the manner of our parting in Kent. After reading your letter, I wanted so desperately to speak with you about the things you wrote. Time and distance have given me much-needed perspective. I dared to enter your world hoping, nay praying, that I might do so completely undetected, because I thought you despised me. And yet you have shown nothing but kindness to my mother and me." "I could never despise you. I... The door swung open, and in walked Lady Davenport and her younger daughter. Darcy meant to stand, but her ladyship held up her hand. "Oh, sir, you mustn't stand. Pray forgive our tardiness this morning." Elizabeth stood, preparing to quit the room. Darcy said, "Miss Elizabeth, I do hope you and I will have the opportunity to continue our discussion." She half smiled. "I should like that, sir." Lady Davenport said, "Oh, Miss Bennet, I do hope you are not leaving on our account. We have hardly had any time to get to know you, and I am so interested in hearing all the intimate details of how you and Mr. Darcy became acquainted. I believe you said the two of you first met in Hertfordshire, did you not, Mr. Darcy? I must say Hertfordshire is a long way from Derbyshire." Lady Bethany gave her mother a knowing smile. "It is, indeed." Elizabeth replied, "I shall leave it to Mr. Darcy to share the particulars of our acquaintance with the two of you as he sees fit. As intimate as you are, I'm sure he will satisfy your curiosity in a manner far more suitable than would a total stranger." Elizabeth then accepted the footman's assistance with her chair, and slightly curtsied. "Lady Davenport, Lady Bethany, Mr. Darcy," she said, and then she went away. "My, how impertinent she is for one who is so young. Pray, how old is Miss Bennet, sir?" Lady Davenport inquired. "I believe she would be the one to tell you that, your ladyship." "On the contrary, for it seems she has delegated the task of bettering our acquaintance with one another to you." "Did she enjoy a proper coming out? I have no recollection of ever seeing her in town," said Lady Bethany. Her mother hissed, "My dear, I'm sure she did not. Her kind really does." Lady Bethany said, "I'm sure I do not know quite what to make of her. She is always confining herself to solitary walks about the park, and she will not give herself the trouble of spending time with any of us when she can help it. That is, save Mr. Darcy himself. Pray, you will not meet with many like her in our society, my dear. That young woman seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country town indifference to decorum, if you will." "Aside from being an ardent walker," Lady Bethany said, "it seems she has nothing to recommend herself. She lacks grace and refinement,
and she has little or no beauty to speak of."
"In fairness to the young woman, you are always severe on your own sex. I posit a gentleman's opinion is what's missing from this discussion." She turned to the gentleman, whose countenance she could no longer read. "What say you, Mr. Darcy? I know she is your particular guest, though I am not certain her presence was not contrived. But what do you think of Miss Bennet?" "I confess there was a time when my assessment may not have strayed too far from yours," Darcy began. Indeed, he had at first scarcely allowed Elizabeth to be pretty. He had looked at her without admiration at the Meryton Assembly. When they next met, he looked at her only to criticise. But no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she hardly had a good feature in her face, than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. Though he had detected with a critical eye more than one failure of perfect symmetry in her form, he was forced to acknowledge her figure to be light and pleasing, and in spite of his asserting that her manners were not those of the fashionable world, he was caught by their easy playfulness. He laid his paper aside in preparation to quit the room. However, it was not long afterward that I began to consider Miss Elizabeth Bennet the handsomest and the most admirable woman of my acquaintance. Darcy stood. "If you ladies will excuse me, I must be off." Sitting alone in the park, Elizabeth was roused from her seat and her reflections by someone's approach. Before she could strike into another path, Lord Davenport overtook her. "I'm afraid I'm interrupting your solitary ramble, Miss Bennet," said he as he joined her. "You certainly are," she replied with a smile, "but it does not follow that the interruption must be unwelcome." "I should be sorry indeed if it were. I should hate to think I might miss out on the pleasure of extending our acquaintance entirely." "I am sorry to have given you such an impression that I have been avoiding you, my lord, for that was not my intention," she lied. "Are the others coming out?" "I do not think so. Darcy and Lady Althea are going in the carriage to Lambton. The two of them seem to enjoy their little excursions exceedingly well. Lady Davenport and Lady Bethany mentioned their desire for a morning of leisure. It appears that you and I must rely on each other for company for the next few hours. Pray that meets with your approval." "I do not know that I have any cause to repine, my lord." "It pleases me to hear you say that. By the by, I must say what a pleasure it was to meet your mother. Mrs. Bennet was a most delightful addition to our party last evening." "She will be delighted to know that, my lord." "I would add that I was shocked to hear that you had rejected the hand of not one, but 2 suitors." "Shocked?" "Indeed. For a woman in your situation to have such confidence in yourself when there was no guarantee that you would receive a second proposal. Then, when you did, despite phenomenal odds, you rejected a second proposal. It is unfathomable, I tell you." "My situation?" "Well, how else would one describe being one of 5 daughters of a country gentleman who lacks fortune and connections?"
"I suppose being the daughter of an earl would increase one's chances appreciably. Why, take your daughters, for instance. Your 2 single daughters. Between the 2 of them there must be at least one disappointed suitor roaming the land."
"My daughter's situation is nothing at all like yours. In fact, I expect one of them will be the recipient of many happy felicitations before long."
"Is that so?" They were now almost at the door of the house, for she had walked fast in order to be rid of him.
"Indeed. One would have to be blind not to see it for themselves, which begs the question."
"What question is that?"
"How would you feel about that, Miss Bennet?" she heard the Earl ask.
"I can't help thinking you are trying hard not to say that which you clearly mean, and thus I shall spare you the trouble. If it is indeed Mr. Darcy's intention to select one of your daughters as his bride, then I would be obliged to wish him joy, would I not?" Elizabeth curtsied. "Good day, my lord." With that, she bolted up the stone stairs and into the manor house. She might well have denied him the pleasure he sought in beseeching her with such untoward innuendo, but she could not deny the persistent pang of regret that plucked at her heartstrings with the thought of such a prospect as the Earl espoused. Oh, what did I expect? Having done his best to rattle Elizabeth, Lord Davenport decided to seek out Darcy himself.
He found him later that same day in Darcy's study. "I've enjoyed the most pleasant conversation with your guest today." "Which guest?" "Why, the lovely Miss Elizabeth Bennet," he responded with a gracious, albeit taunting air. Darcy remained silent. "You have nothing to say? What would you have me say?" "You will forgive me for thinking there is more to her being here than you have allowed. On the other hand, I have no right to complain, as you have been more than attentive to both of my daughters. I mentioned as much to Miss Bennet. I mentioned that one of my daughters might soon be the recipient of joyful felicitations when a certain anticipated event takes place." Darcy stood. Planting his fists firmly on his desk, he said, "Why would you take it upon yourself to discuss such matters with Miss Bennet?" "Oh, is that not the purpose of our being here? Have we not come all this way to allow you to choose a bride from among my daughters?" "You are taking a great deal for granted in making such a claim." His face humourless, his voice stern, the Earl said, "Do not cross me, young man. With all due respect, you had no right to discuss such matters with my guest." "I feel I did. I have my daughter's interest to consider." Darcy rubbed his brow. "Your daughters are perfectly safe from me. Do you promise me that I have nothing with which to concern myself?" "I shall certainly not assume the burden of promising anything that will be the means of satisfying your peace of mind. I would remind you of who you are, young man. Much is expected of you." "Sir, I am more than aware of my responsibilities to Pemberley." "No doubt you are. But you are equally obliged to honour your family name, your noble lineage. I do not need to tell you that a union between our noble families would be hailed as splendid. Have you any doubt that either of my daughters would be an excellent future companion?" "Indeed, I do not doubt it at all, sir." "Then what say you we make it official? Make a formal announcement that our families are to be united." "I will not be rushed into anything." "While you continue to take your time in forming a conclusion, you ought to remember this." Darcy's silence encouraged the blustering Earl to continue. "Knowing that you might have had your choice of either of my daughters, society will never forgive you should you conclude recklessly. Doors that otherwise would have been open to you will forever be closed." His voice measured. Darcy said, "Any doors that might be closed to me owing to a decision I make for my own marital felicity are doors that I have no wish nor any need to enter." Chapter 11. So Clever for Nothing. Elizabeth had been a good deal disappointed in not finding a letter from Jane on her arrival at Lambton. This disappointment had been renewed on each of the mornings that had now been spent at Pemberley. Finally, her repining was over, and her sister justified by the receipt of 2 letters from her at once, on one of which was marked that it had been directed elsewhere by mistake. Elizabeth was not surprised at it, for Jane had written the direction remarkably ill. Wanting to enjoy the letters in quiet, Elizabeth set off for what was by now her favourite alcove nearby the east garden. Other than Mr. Darcy, who had seen her there once or twice, no one would think to find her there. The misdirected one must first be attended to. It had been written more than 5 days ago. The beginning contained an account of all their little parties and engagements, with such news as the country afforded, but the latter half, which was dated a day later, and written in evident agitation, gave more important intelligence. With no one else about, Elizabeth commenced reading part of the letter aloud. "Since writing the above, dearest Lizzie, something has occurred of a most unexpected and serious nature, but I'm afraid of alarming you. Be assured that we are all well. What I have to say to you relates to poor Lydia. An express came at 12 last night, just as we were all gone to bed, from Colonel Forster, to inform us that she was gone off to Scotland with one of his officers, to own the truth, with Wickham." Elizabeth tore her eyes from the letter. Her voice pained, she said, "Poor Lydia! She knows not what she has done." She continued reading the letter, but now in silence. It was Jane's wont to see the bright side of things, and this business between Lydia and Wickham was no different. Without allowing herself time for consideration, and scarcely knowing what she felt, Elizabeth, on finishing the first letter, instantly seized the other and opened it with the utmost impatience. It had been written a day later than the conclusion of the first. Again she began reading aloud. "By this time, my dearest sister, you will have received my hurried letter. I wish this may be more intelligible, but though not confined for time, my head is so bewildered that I cannot answer for being coherent. Dearest Lizzie, I hardly know what I would write, but I have bad news for you, and it cannot be delayed." Elizabeth gasped. It was as though she could no longer breathe. What could have compelled Lydia to behave so foolishly? She read more of Jane's letter. "Poor Lydia believed herself to be eloping to Gretna Green." Elizabeth voiced aloud, "All the prevailing evidence suggests otherwise." Jane's account grew graver with each line, leaving Elizabeth in quite a state of despair. Now finished reading the words no sister ever wanted to have ascribed to the actions of a loved one, Elizabeth remained seated, her hands wrapped around her shoulders in self-comfort, crying her heart out. Looking up, she saw that her solitude was about to be interrupted. "It's Mr. Darcy. How shall I ever face him?" Face him she must. There had been just enough time to allow her to stand before he was directly upon her. "I've been looking all over for you. I'm hoping we might continue where we left off earlier." Elizabeth looked up at him with tears welling in her eyes. Seeing her thus, with more feeling than politeness, he cried, "Good God! What is the matter? Are you ill? May I accompany you back to the house?" "No, I thank you," she replied, endeavouring to recover herself. "There is nothing the matter with me. I'm quite well. I'm only distressed by some dreadful news that I've just received from Longbourn." She burst into tears as she alluded to it, and for a few minutes could not speak another word. Darcy, in wretched suspense, could only say something indistinctly of his concern, and observe her in compassionate silence. At length she spoke again. "I've just read a letter from Jane, with such dreadful news. It cannot be concealed from anyone. My younger sister has left all her friends, has eloped, has thrown herself into the power of Mr. Wickham. They are gone off together from Brighton. You know him too well to doubt the rest. She has no money, no connections, nothing that can tempt him to... She is lost forever." Her hands shaking, she folded the letters and tucked them into her pocket. She looked at him imploringly. "My mother and I must return to Longbourn as soon as can be. Our family needs to be together at such a time as this." Darcy nodded. "I shall prepare for our departure at once." "Oh no, I could never ask nor expect you to abandon your other guests. It will be more than enough if you would make a carriage available to us." "I gave your uncle Mr. Gardiner my assurance that I would see to your safe return, and I aim to keep my promise." Elizabeth knew her mother well enough to know she would not receive the news of Lydia's shameful behaviour well. What a spectacle she would make! All the consideration and patience in the world on Mr. Darcy's part would be insufficient to endure such a steady outpouring of vexations throughout the trip to Hertfordshire. Elizabeth said, "Mr. Darcy, I believe it is imperative that my mother is told nothing of what has befallen Lydia. Who is to say how she would react? Heaven forbid that I say or do anything to cause a setback in her recovery. Yet she must be told something that is compelling enough to persuade her to depart on such short notice as this without alarming her. Of course, you know your mother best. You may rely upon my discretion. With that being said, it is a far distance between Derbyshire and Hertfordshire. Do you really suppose you will be able to conceal your own pain and suffering from her for so long a duration?" Elizabeth wiped away a tear from her face. "I do not know that I have a choice. Such an unfolding of events as Jane's letter foretells might well prove too difficult for Mamma to endure with composure." Elizabeth's voice took on a measure of hope. "Besides, there is always the possibility that Lydia and Mr. Wickham did indeed elope to Gretna Green. News of their marriage might very well await us upon our arrival, in which case Mamma would be ecstatic. Miss Elizabeth, the last thing in the world I wish to do is rob you of that hope. But knowing Wickham as I do, There's no chance of such a conclusion." Her tears resumed falling. Elizabeth cried, "Oh, Mr. Darcy, this is all my fault. All this I might have prevented had I been more open with my sisters about Wickham's true character. I simply never considered that he might prey upon the likes of my sister. She is so young, so foolish, and so naive. What is to become of her?" Darcy removed his handkerchief and commenced wiping her tears. Elizabeth, realizing the impropriety, lifted her hand to take hold of the crisp linen cloth and began dabbing at her eyes. At length she calmed. She looked into his eyes, fearing she might read in them pity, perhaps even disgust to be acquainted with such a family, and was gratified by what she discerned as sympathy and concern. Being so close to him felt akin to comforting. "You are far kinder to me than I deserve, sir." "Surely you must know that there is nothing I would not do for you." Sniffing, she asked, "When shall we depart?" "I shall speak with my steward so arrangements may be made, as soon as we return to the manor house." Elizabeth gasped. "Miss Darcy and I made plans for later this afternoon. We were to go into Lambton. How shall I face her with composure, knowing what I do about her unhappy past with Mr. Wickham, in light of my own sister's perilous fate? What manner of excuse shall I give that is not tainted by my sister's shame? If you will give me leave, I shall make the proper excuse without mentioning any of this unseemliness. I will find the words to make her understand. Your sister is blessed to have a brother who attends her so diligently. My sister Lydia should be so fortunate," Elizabeth said wistfully. "For now you must attend your mother, and I will attend to everything else." Less than a quarter hour later, Elizabeth stood outside her mother's apartment, yet undecided of what she might say. Collecting herself, she opened the door and walked inside. She espied her mother sitting by the window. She took the seat opposite her. "Mamma," she said, "I have come to tell you that we are to take our leave from Pemberley as soon as it can be arranged." "So soon? Pray, what is the urgency?" "You know that I have never been comfortable with the idea of our being here. I have said as much to Mr. Darcy on more than one occasion. He has agreed to escort us to Hertfordshire just as he promised Uncle Gardiner that he would, once you were sufficiently recovered to travel." "Ah, now I see exactly what you're about. I knew you could not be so clever for nothing." "What do you mean?" "No doubt you've surmised that it is in your best interest to get Mr. Darcy as far from those scheming Davenport sisters as possible, so you might have him all to yourself. What a clever girl you are indeed. Mr. Darcy and you will be engaged to be married by the time we arrive in Hertfordshire. Mark my words." "Mamma!" "Oh, you need not pretend to be shocked on my account. Mr. Darcy is clearly in your power, else he would not abandon his other guests." "Mamma, you are mistaken." "Oh, hush, child. Your feeble protests are wasted on me, and you need not worry. I shall not breathe a word of any of this to anyone, and certainly not Mr. Darcy. Your little scheme is safe with me." Meanwhile, another party had arrived. Darcy had been made aware of this upon visiting the stable to speak with his head groomsman to prepare for his imminent departure. By the time he arrived at the manor house, his new guests were getting settled. Darcy was not pleased with this intrusion, however, as it was Charles Bingley and his family. There was no chance they would be turned away, even if Darcy was making plans to be away from Pemberley for the indeterminate future. Despite scarcely having a moment to spare, Darcy thought he ought to spend a little time with the new guests. He had always treated them most hospitably. He could do no less today, even though time was of the essence if they were to make the most of that day's travel. Miss Bingley said, "Did my eyes deceive me earlier, or was that Miss Eliza Bennet whom I saw making her way up the stairs?" "Indeed, Miss Elizabeth is my guest. She and her mother." Miss Bingley gasped. "The last thing I heard, Miss Bennet was one of your least favourite people in the world. Heaven knows the woman never gave a fig about your good opinion. You must certainly recall the disgusting manner in which she tried to force an alliance between my brother and her eldest daughter when we last saw her in Hertfordshire. How on earth did she come to be a guest at Pemberley?"
She fell ill while touring the grounds some days ago. My physician prescribed bed rest until she was well enough to travel to Hertfordshire." The young woman rolled her eyes. "What is it about those Bennets always falling ill in the homes of unsuspecting, wealthy young men? I'm surprised you took part in such trickery, sir."
"Regardless of the circumstances, I assume responsibility for everything that happens at Pemberley. And now that Mrs. Bennet is capable of travelling without danger to her recovery, I'm obliged to see to her safe return to Hertfordshire." Darcy turned to his friend Charles Bingley. "I would ask you to accompany me upstairs while I attend to last-minute preparations, if you will." Bingley readily acceded to his friend's request, and they went on their way. When the two of them were in Darcy's apartment, Bingley said, "I had not planned to come, but once Caroline learned that the Davenports were here, she simply would not be dissuaded. You never need apologise for calling at Pemberley. Yours is a standing invitation. I do, however, feel I ought to be apologising to you for having to depart on the heels of your arrival." "Yes, you said you're escorting Mrs. Bennet and Miss Elizabeth to Hertfordshire. Is there something that you're not telling me, that perhaps I ought to know?" "I am sworn to secrecy regarding the urgency of my leave-taking. I cannot betray a confidence." Bingley replied, "It is enough said, my friend. However, you must answer me this. How can I be of service?" Darcy placed his hand on Bingley's shoulder. "It would mean a great deal to me if you would remain at Pemberley and watch over my home and my guests until I return. I would much rather my sister were not forced to entertain a house full of people in my absence." "You may depend upon me, Darcy." "Thank you, Charles. You've always been a good friend to me. I shall tell you all there is to know in time." Indeed, there was much to tell. Bingley truly had been a better friend than Darcy felt he had been to him. Upon learning that Elizabeth was there, Bingley's disappointment that Miss Jane Bennet was not there also was painfully evident. He still loves her. In thinking my actions had been the means of saving my friend from what I perceived as a most ill-advised alliance, I've been a party to wounding him severely. Elizabeth's harsh rebuke for his part in separating Bingley and her elder sister came to mind. "You dare not, you cannot deny that you have been the principal, if not the only means of dividing them from each other, of exposing one to the censure of the world for caprice and instability, and the other to its derision for disappointed hopes, and involving them both in misery of the acutest kind." Rarely before had Darcy suffered such dismay over what he had done. He brushed his fingers through his hair. Will Bingley find it in himself to forgive me? The abruptness of Mr. Darcy's leave-taking, so soon upon the heels of their arrival, caused Caroline an inordinate amount of vexation. With nothing better to do, she contented herself by venting her feelings in criticism of Elizabeth's person, behaviour, and dress. But Georgiana would not join her. Her brother's recommendation was enough to ensure her favour. His judgment could not err. And he had spoken in such terms of Elizabeth as to leave Georgiana without the power of finding her otherwise than lovely and amiable. When Bingley returned to the saloon after seeing Darcy and the Bennets off, Miss Bingley could not help repeating to him some part of what she had been saying to Georgiana and her own sister, Mrs. Louisa Hurst. "How very ill Miss Eliza Bennet looked," she cried. "I never in my life saw anyone so much altered as she is since the winter. Louisa and I were agreeing that we should not have known her again." However little Mr. Bingley might have liked such a speech, he coolly replied that he perceived no other alteration than her being rather tanned, no miraculous consequence of travelling in the summer. "For my own part," Caroline rejoined, "I must confess that I never could see any beauty in her. Her face is too thin, her complexion has no brilliancy, and her features are not at all handsome. Her nose wants character. There is nothing marked in its lines. Her teeth are tolerable, but not out of the common way. And as for her eyes, which have sometimes been called so fine, I could never see anything extraordinary in them. They have a sharp, shrewish look, which I do not like at all, and in her air altogether there is a self-sufficiency without fashion, which is intolerable." Young Miss Darcy could no longer remain silent. "I am sorry to hear you speak this way," she said. "But for my brother's part, more than once I have heard him remark that he has long considered Miss Elizabeth to be the handsomest woman of his acquaintance."
Chapter 12. Measure of Hope. Enduring the long trip from Derbyshire to Hertfordshire, while hiding her own pain and uncertainty over what Lydia had done in an effort to keep the truth away from Mrs. Bennet, had not been easy. But Elizabeth, with Darcy's help, had done it. As the carriage drew near to Longbourn village, Mrs. Bennet's restlessness grew. She could tell that Mr. Darcy and her daughter were getting along, but there had been no renewal of his marriage proposal. If only the trip had not seemed so rushed. She attributed Mr. Darcy's haste to his frequent assertions of having urgent business in town. Mrs. Bennet was half tempted to suggest her daughter find some excuse to accompany the gentleman. She surely would have, if she supposed for one instance that Elizabeth might go along with such a scheme. It had vexed her exceedingly when she had learned that the Davenports remained at Pemberley, and would be there when Mr. Darcy returned. "Oh, it is unconscionable that either of those two should claim what is rightfully my daughter's," she said to the gentleman who sat across from her in the luxury barouche. "Mr. Darcy, you must take a family dinner with us. It is only proper in light of your kindness to us." "But, mamma, accepting such an invitation would delay Mr. Darcy's departure to London at least until tomorrow, for he cannot be expected to travel after dark." "As well he should not. Sir, you must accept Longbourn's hospitality by staying at our home. It is the least we can do. True, it is not so grand as Pemberley, but I assure you that you shall have the best room." Darcy had no wish to part with Elizabeth so soon, although he knew that time was of the essence if he were to do all in his power to discover the whereabouts of Wickham and the youngest Bennet daughter. Accepting Mrs. Bennet's invitation would mean that much longer in Elizabeth's company before they were to be parted for weeks. However, such a pleasure was not advisable. Once he had accomplished his goal, he planned to return to Derbyshire and his house guests. After that, he'd return to Hertfordshire and remain there for as long as it took to change Elizabeth's mind, or until any such hope was gone. Jane, Mary, and Kitty raced to their mother's side as soon as she entered the house. Mary, who under normal circumstances might have been reverent and subdued, seized one of Mrs. Bennet's arms, and Kitty, who was much more excitable, caught hold of the other. All three Bennet daughters told their mother what had happened during their absence, with varying degrees of excitability. For a moment, the elderly matriarch did not know how to look or how to feel. A second or two later, exultations of her Lydia being married and barely 16 rang throughout the halls of Longbourn. It was as vulgar as Elizabeth had feared, and made worse with Mr. Darcy standing there and seeing and hearing it all. When it was made perfectly clear that such happiness was premature at best, and most likely not forthcoming at all, Mrs. Bennet's disappointment was palpable. Her ardent protests of Lydia's being ill-used, her recriminations against the neglectful Colonel Forster and his silly wife, and her complaints against herself for ever having allowed her youngest to travel so far without a mother's supervision, rendered her earlier exultations moot. Even deeper shades of gloom and despair were cast throughout Longbourn village. "Mr. Bennet will be forced to hunt down the vile Mr. Wickham, and when he finds him, Mr. Bennet shall be killed. Oh, I just know it," she cried. "Then what shall become of us?" On Jane's advice, Mary and Kitty escorted their mother up the stairs and to her apartment. The younger girls stayed with their mother for a while before quitting the room with the hope that she might get some much-needed rest. They had been gone under a minute when Mrs. Bennet's lamentations resumed. "My Lydia is ruined! Our family is ruined! Oh, what must Mr. Darcy think? Well, this I know. He will never marry Lizzie now." Meanwhile, Elizabeth beseeched Jane to tell her everything that had happened in the attempts to recover Lydia in those ensuing days since Jane's last letter. This caused Jane to look at her sister, and then Mr. Darcy, as though weighing what was best said, and what must surely be concealed in the gentleman's presence. Elizabeth said, "You may speak openly in front of Mr. Darcy. He has been a most trusted ally throughout this ordeal." Looking at Darcy, and he at her, she continued, "I do not know what I should have done without him." This was sufficient encouragement for Jane to reply, "Having read my second letter, you will recall my telling you that Papa has gone to London to take part in the search for Lydia." "And has there been any news of their success?" Elizabeth begged. Jane shook her head. "All efforts have been in vain."
After giving a thorough account of everything that she knew at Elizabeth's continued beckoning, Jane said, "It truly does appear that Lydia and Mr. Wickham have vanished from the face of the earth." Jane, as if sensing that Mr. Darcy and her sister were in want of some measure of privacy before the gentleman took his leave of Longbourn, made the excuse of needing to attend her mother, and then quit the room. Darcy certainly did want some time alone with Elizabeth. She no doubt felt the same. But the bleakness of the situation left very little to be said that had not already been said. Seeing the hopelessness in Elizabeth's face, now that she was back at Longbourn, surrounded by the consequences of what Lydia had done, pained him even more than when he had come upon her reading Jane's letters days ago at Pemberley. The certain ruination of her family was undeniable, unless something could be done to recover Lydia Bennet. And what of all Mrs. Bennet had said about Mr. Bennet fighting Wickham should he prove successful in finding him? It was not an unreasonable conjecture. The older man's honour might well prevail on him to do just that, should Wickham prove impossible to be worked on. As much as Darcy wanted to stay with Elizabeth a while longer before taking his leave, he could not. Time was of the essence, and far too many days had passed already, allowing Wickham to carry out his mischief. Ever since Darcy learned of the travesty, he'd been silently sketching out a plan to go to London to take part in the search. But he could not possibly share his intentions with Elizabeth, because he did not wish to give her false hope. Little did he know, Elizabeth would have welcomed such intelligence, for any measure of hope was better than none at all. Along with his leave-taking also went the last vestiges of hope that she might ever see him again. Chapter 13. A Love Match. All he had seen disgusted Darcy. Even the measures he had undertaken to recover young Lydia Bennet, and thereby rescue the Bennet family's reputation from the ashes of ruin, were abhorrent. The entire time he told himself he was doing it for Elizabeth's sake. Indeed, anything that could be done to afford a better outcome than would otherwise be possible, he did. Now he was sitting alone in his carriage on the lonely journey back to Pemberley, where his sister, his friend, and his house full of neglected guests awaited him. He might have delayed his return by a day or two, allowing for a trip to Longbourn, but what would have been the point? He and Elizabeth had not parted with a formal agreement between them. Even if they had, the last thing in the world he wished was to lay eyes on Wickham again. He knew with certainty that the newlyweds planned to call on Longbourn before journeying to Newcastle, a town in the north where a newly purchased commission awaited Wickham. Darcy peered out the window. It would not be long now before he entered Pemberley Woods. Just the sight of familiar surroundings were a balm to his soul. He loved this part of the country. Were it not for the falling rain, he would surely be on horseback, racing across the open field with his groom trailing along behind him. Then he might arrive with little fanfare and enjoy a bit of tranquillity before the others were aware he had returned. No doubt Lord Davenport would want an answer from him as to which of his daughters Darcy had chosen. What a mistake he had made in believing there would ever be another woman for him, in endeavouring to persuade his battered heart that he should give up the hope of a life with Elizabeth, and that he should attempt to find happiness with another. As much as Elizabeth had prayed and hoped against hope for the safe recovery of her younger sister from the arms of danger, derision, and scandal, more than once did she wish the Wickhams would simply go away. She truly loved her younger sister, but she absolutely abhorred the newest addition to their family, her sister's husband, this wicked man whom she must refer to as her brother forevermore. She abhorred him for what he had done to young Georgiana Darcy. She abhorred him for what he meant to do to her own sister. And most of all, she abhorred him for persuading her of his goodness. She would have liked to think it was fitting that his reward should be a lifetime spent with one of the silliest girls in all of England. But how could she? Always best described as wild and untamed, Lydia was as eager as she was easy pickings for a scoundrel like George Wickham. But she surely did not deserve to spend the rest of her days with such a man, even if she fancied herself the happiest and the luckiest girl in all of England. Lydia's exultations of all the good fun she'd had since escaping the Forsters' protection were not totally a series of one shameful exploit after another. Lydia had mistakenly confided Mr. Darcy's role in the affair,
Not contented to rely solely upon Lydia's version of events, Elizabeth wrote to her aunt Mrs. Gardiner to learn the truth. She was in a fair way of remembering parts of the missive containing her aunt's response. Elizabeth read the first part in silence. Nearing its end, she began reading aloud. Mr. Darcy was punctual in his return, and, as Lydia informed you, attended the wedding. He dined with us the next day, and was to leave town again on Wednesday or Thursday. Will you be very angry with me, my dear Lizzie, if I take this opportunity of saying how much I like him? In every respect, his behaviour to us has been as pleasing as when we were in Derbyshire. His understanding and opinions all please me. I contend he wants nothing but a little more liveliness, and that, if he married prudently, his wife may teach him. I thought him very sly, for he hardly ever mentioned your name, but slyness seems the fashion. Pray forgive me if I have been very presuming, or at least do not punish me so far as to exclude me from P. I shall never be quite happy till I have been all round the park. A low phaeton with a nice little pair of ponies would be the very thing. The irony of those last lines did not fail to impress upon Elizabeth the unlikelihood that such a prospect would unfold. She was not designed for ill humour. However, she could hardly be unaffected by the awareness that she might never see Pemberley again. How else could she explain Mr. Darcy's continued absence? She understood that calling at Longbourn would be the last thing he would wish to do while the Wickhams were there. Lydia and her husband have been gone for more than a fortnight. As intimate as Mr. Darcy is with the affairs of the couple's hasty union, surely he would know that. Not for the first time did she then recall the situation that likely awaited him in Derbyshire. 3 eager young women, who would do anything to assume the position that Elizabeth had so callously eschewed. I must not leave Miss Caroline Bingley out of the equation, she thought with a hint of amusement that was not quite sufficient to absolve herself of what was feeling more and more like regret. Pemberley just wasn't Pemberley any more. Elizabeth existed in every corner of Darcy's home. Her laughter lingered in his ears. Her faint scent of lavender lingered in his mind. She'd been there for less than a week, yet Darcy felt her presence everywhere. However, she wasn't there, and because she wasn't there, Darcy did not wish to be there either. He invited Lord Davenport to his study for a talk that was long overdue. While it was Mr. Darcy's home, Lord Davenport held the high rank, and he made certain Darcy did not forget it. The aggrieved Earl stormed about the room with complaints of being ill-used, when Darcy told the older man that which the latter never wished to hear. "I am sorry my decision meets with your disapproval, my lord. Surely, once you have given this matter its proper consideration, you will find it is for the best for all parties concerned. Your daughters, either of them, deserve better than to be attached to a man whose heart belongs to another." "What is it with young people today? What does one's heart have to do with anything? Marriages are meant to satisfy the greater needs of the families involved," he huffed. "Your heart, indeed! Why, I've never heard such foolishness. I surely never would have expected to hear such nonsense from the mouth of the sole heir of my good friend, your excellent father Gerald Darcy. Instead of resting in peace, I dare say he is turning in his grave at this very moment. As my father enjoyed a love match in marrying my mother, I am confident he would applaud my decision to accept nothing less for myself." "Gerald Darcy and Lady Anne Fitzwilliam? A love match? You would utter such a thing, but as I was there, I happen to know better. This woman who you claim holds your heart is that Bennet chit, I take it." "I believe I alluded to as much when we were last together in this very room." "Have you no self-respect, man? That little country nothing would make you a laughing-stock, were it generally known that she had spurned your offer all those months ago." "I have no concern what others might say. I am my own master." "It sounds to me as though you are determined to have her. Perchance you think she is unattainable, when really she is yours for the taking, without the sanctity of marriage, especially in the light of what has befallen her family. Do not think for one moment that I am ignorant of it. I know it all. What a disgraceful unfolding of events! Are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted?"
With all due respect, my lord, I will hear no more from you on this subject. In deference to your long-standing friendship with my father, I invited you and your family here as my guests. Indeed, I was at first open to the alliance with either of your daughters. But in furthering my acquaintance with Lady Althea and Lady Bethany, I've come to see how unfair such an alliance would be. My daughters have always been each other's favourite adversary. Both of them knew what they were about in competing for their share of your affections, knowing only one would emerge the victor.
This is hardly a game, my lord, said Darcy.
Is it not, Darcy? I never meant for it to be one.
Perhaps I haven't given you quite the credit you deserve.
What is that supposed to mean? I posit you invited us here knowing that other women would be here too. I posit you intended to use my daughters as pawns in your scheme to make the Bennet girl jealous. All of this was part of a grand design to get her to reconsider your proposal. Do you fail to recall that your being here was largely by your own contrivance? Perhaps I was merely a willing dupe. Perhaps for the sake of future harmony between our families, you would be wise to desist in this line of discussion. I made you no promises, save the hospitality of Pemberley for the better part of the summer. I have done my part. What is more, I have returned to speak with you personally, when I might well have remained in London. Having spoken to you, I now intend to speak with Lady Althea and Lady Bethany, both of whom are dear to me. The prospect that his family's future prosperity by means of Darcy's vast fortune had all but vanished was not an easy swallow. The Earl said, I implore you to think better of what you're about. A union between our families would be applauded throughout the land. I have no sons. Choose my eldest, Lady Althea, and you will have the world at your feet. You need not abandon your heart's desire. You might have it all, including the Bennet woman. That is how it has always been done. It's the way of our world. You go too far, my lord. Every word I say is true, and you very well know it. The truth is that I would never dishonour either of your daughters in such a manner. I would never dishonour myself in such a manner, and I most certainly shall never dishonour the woman I love. Chapter 14. Help him along. Her hands braced on the window-sill, Mrs. Bennet peered outside. Drawing away, she rested one hand on her bosom. "We are saved!" she rejoiced. She stole another glance out the window. "Thank heavens we are saved!" There was no other way for her to describe her joy in seeing the tall, handsome gentleman coming to the house. Indeed, Mr. Darcy had returned. In Mrs. Bennet's eager brain, this could only mean one thing. He meant to ask for Elizabeth's hand. What's more, he brought his charming friend, Mr. Bingley, with him. If I play my hand correctly, there shall be 2 proposals before the day is done. Soon after the gentleman was settled, and all the usual greetings and pleasantries exchanged, Mrs. Bennet said, "Lizzie, I advise you to walk to Oakham Mount this morning. It is a nice, long walk, and Mr. Darcy has never seen the view." Darcy professed a great curiosity to see the view from the Mount, and Elizabeth silently consented. Mrs. Bennet knew he would feel that way. Her plan was working. Leaving nothing to chance, she took Elizabeth aside. "You must take all the time you need. And mind you, none of your impertinence either, young lady. True, the gentleman took long enough to make up his mind, but the material fact is that he is here now. Now you must be quiet and listen to what he has to say. But you must not be too quiet. What I long perceived as haughtiness in the young man turns out to be little more than shyness. Help him along if you must. As well as you know him, you know how he can best be worked on." She threw a furtive glance around the room. Her eyes rested on Mr. Bingley. "Oh, and do take your sister Jane with you to keep his friend company. I suspect that gentleman did not come here for nothing. He means to pick up where he left off when he was at Netherfield last autumn, no doubt. You must allow the 2 of them a good measure of privacy, just as you and your gentleman friend will require it." She beckoned Jane to her side. "Run along upstairs with your sister, my dear. You must both get ready. Pray fetch your best bonnets, and do be quick about it, for we must not keep the gentlemen callers waiting." Elizabeth was not nearly so confident as her mother. She could think of any number of reasons for Mr. Darcy to be there. What if he had weighed the advantages versus the disadvantages of being connected to the Bennet family, and decided it was not worth the trouble? He did, after all, have his young sister's future marital prospects to consider. Who could blame him for not wanting a connection between his family and George Wickham? The worry that would not go away was the thought that he might have chosen another as his wife. Perhaps he was there to inform her in person. After what he had done for her family, she did not believe he was indifferent to her. She honestly believed he did hold her in esteem, even if he did not love her so much as he once did. He's too generous not to convey such sentiments face to face. Of course he would come. Darcy and Elizabeth had walked very slowly, as was their wont to do, and by now Jane and Bingley had outpaced them. Having exhausted all the inconsequential topics that were reserved for those occasions when two old acquaintances had not seen each other for a long time, Elizabeth's curiosity would no longer be repressed. If nothing else, she would speak to him about what he had done for her sisters. Expressing her gratitude to him for bringing his friend Bingley and providing the means for a happy outcome for her dearest sister was easily done. Thanking him for helping young Lydia was a cause for some measure of trepidation. Fashioning her speech, she took a deep breath. "Mr. Darcy, I'm a very selfish creature, and at the risk of wounding your feelings, I cannot help but relieve my own. I simply must thank you for your unparalleled kindness to my poor sister. Ever since I've known it, I've been most anxious to acknowledge to you how gratefully I feel it. Were it known to the rest of my family, I should not have merely my own gratitude to express." Surprised, Darcy said, "I'm sorry that you were informed of my part in what happened. I had hoped Mrs. Gardiner would keep it in confidence." "Sir, pray do not blame my aunt. Lydia unwittingly spoke of your having been at the wedding, and I could not rest until I knew the particulars. Let me thank you again and again, in the name of all my family, for that generous compassion that induced you to take so much trouble. No doubt you bore any number of mortifications in your endeavour to discover her." Darcy said, "If you will thank me, then let it be for yourself alone. Your family, they owe me nothing. Much as I respect them, I believe I thought only of you." His avowal had been most unexpected, and indeed it was cause for a flicker of renewed hope. After a short pause, her companion added, "Although I feel in some ways I've done your sister a grave disservice, even if she cannot or will not see it. You, better than most, know how much I abhor Wickham, and why I feel as I do. No one ought to suffer a connection with that scoundrel. Surely such a connection does your family no credit. It is but one of my regrets over what happened." Elizabeth lowered her eyes as though wishing to have no part of what was coming, the conclusive moment where he would expound upon those reasons why a union between them would never come to be. Darcy said, "Pray do not misunderstand me. What is done, and there is nothing left to do, save move forward. Which brings me to my reason for returning to Hertfordshire. You are too generous to trifle with me. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on this subject forever." "Sir," she responded, "at the risk of expressing my sentiments in a manner reminiscent of Mamma, let me just say that my feelings have suffered so material a change as to receive your reassurances with all that is pleasant and filled with gratitude. What's more, I must further declare myself the happiest woman in all of England." The happiness that this reply produced was such as he had probably never felt before. A sidelong glance in his direction allowed her to see just how well the expression of heartfelt delight diffused over his face became him. Her spirits far lighter now than when they had first set out, she recalled two other young women who had aspired to claim her present joy. She asked, "What of the Davenports? Do they remain at Pemberley?" "No, they have returned to their own home."
At the risk of introducing disharmony, sir, I would never be quite satisfied with myself were I not to tell you my deepest concern in that regard.
You must know you can tell me anything. What is it?
Well, I cannot help feeling that, were it not for my mother's contrivances, you never would have sought me out.
You might very well be on the verge of asking either of the Davenport sisters to be your wife. One can never know with certainty what might have happened. Perchance what you surmise is possible. But this much I know with absolute certainty to be the truth.
He halted his footsteps, prompting Elizabeth to do the same. They turned and faced each other. I had not been with you at Pemberley for a second before realizing that no one takes the place of you. He took Elizabeth by her hand, raised it, and brushed a kiss across her knuckles. You know not what you do to me. Her hand still in his, he kissed her palm. I am your humble servant. Darcy placed his free hand on her chin, gently coaxing her to look into his eyes. You have bewitched me like no other, and never more so than now, when we are together like this. Darcy had waited so long for that moment, to touch her hand, her slender neckline, and her lovely face, in a manner that would impress upon her just what she meant to him. He longed to savour the sweet taste of her lips, slowly, gently. He placed his hands about her neck, tenderly massaged her under her chin, as he lifted her head and leaned in. The ever-constant rhythms of late summer fell silent to her ears. All Elizabeth could hear was her heart thumping in wonderment, in excitement, in joyful anticipation, and at last, in blissful surrender when his lips met hers. Kissing Mr. Darcy was everything she had dreamed it would be. Everything a first kiss ought to be. At length, the young lovers rested their foreheads together. The past weeks away from you have taught me this, Darcy spoke tenderly. I never wish for us to be parted again. Now that you've accepted my proposal, my dearest, loveliest Elizabeth, we shall be together for the rest of our days. Chapter 15. Sufficient Inducement. Mrs. Bennet could surely claim her happiness some short weeks later. With 2 daughters married, and a third on the way to the altar in a couple of months, it was a happy time indeed. Her joy over her youngest daughter's elopement with the dashing Mr. Wickham was only outweighed by her second eldest daughter's marriage by special licence. Only 2 daughters remained unattached. Mrs. Bennet was confident that in no time at all Kitty and Mary would be well settled too. What man would not wish to align himself with the Bennet family now? Mr. Darcy's noble connections alone would be sufficient inducement, which was nothing in comparison to his vast wealth. Having enjoyed Pemberley's hospitality for as long as she did, she was certain the speculation that he had £10,000 a year was a miscalculation. That Mr. Darcy was as good as a lord was something she always prided herself on saying. More than likely he owned half of Derbyshire was another. For Mr. Bennet's part, he thanked his newest son-in-law for all he had done in bringing about a happier outcome than any of them had reason to expect, as regarded the Wickham affair. There was, of course, the obligatory offer to repay him for the expenses incurred, and the expected refusal on Darcy's part. Mr. Bennet felt he owed the young man a measure of gratitude for another consideration as well. But rather than thank him with his words, he did so with his deeds by amending his ways. Besides, mere words would have been insufficient to convey the depths of his gratitude for Darcy's unexampled valour in saving Mrs. Bennet, first, from certain death of drowning, and second, from years of agonizing and grief by clearing her books of 3 of her 5 unmarried daughters. The goings-on of Lord and Lady Davenport were not to be forgotten. Their grievances that Darcy had used them very ill were heard by anyone who would listen. They both tried to make something of the fact that Darcy had encouraged
and subsequently disappointed the hopes of both of their daughters by inviting them to a summer at Pemberley at the same time he was wooing the country upstart who would be the next mistress of Pemberley. The unequal alliance was deemed appalling by all those who would do so, and was applauded by all those who knew Darcy best. Word of Lord Davenport's mismanagement of his fortune, as well as his wife's, was greater fodder for the tongue, which did not completely destroy Lady Althea and Lady Bethany's prospects, but it certainly made it that much harder for them to find husbands of the sort of consequence befitting the daughters of an earl. Lady Althea, with all her grace and charm, attracted the notice of a vicar, and Lady Bethany the notice of an officer. This arrangement suited both daughters perfectly well, for in marrying the vicar whose parsonage house abutted her father's estate, the elder daughter would always have the ready excuse of being invited there. The younger could boast of marrying before the elder, and with her husband being commissioned in a town near her father's estate, she too always had a place at her father's table. What parents would not relish the prospect of always having their offspring nearby? If only either of the two gentlemen had been the means of enriching his estate's all but depleted coffers, Lord Davenport would have had no cause to repine. Miss Caroline Bingley was not at all pleased with the outcome. She had contrived to arrive at Pemberley, when they did, upon learning that Mr. Darcy had invited the Davenports to spend the best part of summer there, and that he meant to choose a wife. Her fondest wishes were for an alliance between the Darcys and the Bingleys. She was meant to be the next mistress of Pemberley, and her brother Charles was meant to marry young Miss Georgiana Darcy. Arriving and finding Eliza Bennet and her horrible mother there had been appalling enough. Later, learning not only that her brother had foolishly offered his hand to Miss Jane Bennet, but also that Mr. Darcy had offered his to that impertinent Eliza, was a dual blow to her hopes and dreams. Still, in wishing to retain the right to visit Pemberley, she dropped all her resentment. She was fonder than ever of Georgiana, almost as attentive to Darcy as heretofore, and paid off every arrear of civility to Elizabeth. Elizabeth and Georgiana had spent precious little time getting acquainted with each other during Elizabeth's brief stay at Pemberley. All that was bound to change, for the newlyweds decided that Georgiana would come to live with them. Darcy's satisfaction with the scheme was greater than Elizabeth's and Georgiana's combined. He always knew that someone like Elizabeth was just what was missing in his young sister's life, and, the truth be told, in his life as well. Lady Catherine de Bourgh received the news with a fair amount of outrage. For weeks after departing Pemberley, she had been planning how she might thwart a marriage between her nephew Darcy and either of Lord Davenport's daughters. She had been livid that Miss Elizabeth Bennet had spurned her offer of taking her under her wing after all her kindness she had extended to the young lady when she was in Kent. Now the reason she had been thus repulsed had been thrust into her face with the force of a sudden gale wind. That little conniving young woman had refused to help her because she meant to have Darcy all along, and she had devised a scheme to entrap him, her ladyship surmised. Lady Catherine had praised her for not using her arts and allurements to entice her nephew in Kent, when nothing could have been further from the truth. Of this Lady Catherine was convinced, which vexed her even more. It was now evident that what that woman lacked while visiting Kent were time and opportunity, her ladyship told herself time and again. There was no wonder she had thrown herself into Darcy's path by arriving at his home uninvited. That young vixen meant to finish what she had started in Kent, her ladyship concluded. Well, that impertinent little upstart will rue the day she crossed me, said Lady Catherine after reading Darcy's letter, informing her of the nuptials. I shall see that they are not received by any decent family in England. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner received the news of Elizabeth's engagement to Mr. Darcy with great pleasure. The Gardiners would like to have claimed some credit for the happy outcome, but they weren't exactly sure such credit was due them. To that day, they'd never quite understood why Mrs. Bennet had broken from their party and ventured so close to the water's edge when Pemberley's gardener had warned them of the hazards. Both of them rightly credited Mrs. Bennet as being cunning, but all the scheming in the world could not force the manner of admiration and affection that would cause two young people whom everyone believed never particularly cared for each other, to surrender their pride and their prejudices, to find their way to the altar. Perhaps Mrs. Bennet knew something that the Gardiners didn't. Indeed, Mrs. Bennet did know. What's more, she knew her second eldest daughter well enough to keep what she knew to herself. It would never have done for her to insist that her daughter marry the rich and handsome Mr. Darcy of Pemberley in Derbyshire. In contriving to force her daughter into a long stay at Pemberley, Mrs. Bennet was confident her daughter would see what a mistake it was to refuse such a man. Still, whatever was the actual reason for the marriage between her daughter and Mr. Darcy, Mrs. Bennet could not say. The one thing she could say with conviction was that in going along on the trip to the north, and falling into the lake and nearly catching her death of cold, she had provided the means of uniting them. This has been As Good as a Lord, written by P. O. Dixon, narrated by Andy Robert.